Councilmember Barry. Councilmember Clay. Here. Councilmember Robinson. Here. Councilmember Siemens.
Present.
Councilmember Snipper.
Here.
Councilmember Wright.
Here.
Hi, Ruben. Councilmember Snipper is here remotely, as he was on Monday night, and Councilmember Barry is on a business trip and has not returned, so will probably not be here. Are there any council comments? I don't see any.
Yeah.
Councilmember Clay.
I want to thank the chief for coming to the crime prevention meeting that we had in the Forest Park neighborhood. Went on for a couple hours talking about the different kinds of things that community members could do. Forest Park neighbors were victims of a rash of unfortunate vandalisms that occurred, and they're interested in making their community safer. And it was a very good meeting. And they're thinking about restarting their neighborhood patrols and looking at other things that they can do. One of my constituents was bitten by a dog in the area of the Jackson Boyd Park, and animal control has come out and is looking for the dog. It apparently is a small brown boxer type dog, and I've heard that it lives somewhere on Boyd Avenue between Jackson and Carroll. And the person who got bit is having to take rabies shots. So Dan, that's in your ward, but Bruce, it's right around the corner from you. So if you happen to know whose dog that is, then we could find out whether or not it has rabies shots. If you have any contacts on that street, that would be great, because then the person could stop taking the rabies vaccination.
Sounds like we're trying to track the dog.
Like we're trying to what?
Track the dog.
With the feedback? Yeah.
And my sense is that people with microphones standing in the air should try leaning them toward them. That might help. At least it used to.
Okay.
Councilmember Robinson. Okay, thank you. Councilmember Snipper. Siemens.
Thank you, Mayor.
It was an S.
I just wanted, some people had asked about Pat Lovelace, who is with us on most council meeting nights, and I just wanted to let them know that Pat is still home ill. He was in the hospital for a while, but he's back home and trying to get back into shape where he can go out and go to the protests and come to the council meetings.
Councilmember Robinson.
And Chief, you're going to get plaudits from all over the place. I want to thank you for responding so quickly when I called City Manager Matthews this afternoon about the water shut off on Lee Avenue. I called the constituent back right away, and she was very happy to hear that the water would be turned on. One hopes tonight.
And Councilmember Snipper, did you have anything? I guess not. Councilmember Wright.
Just two reminders about this Sunday. There's two events. One is the fun run for the Safe Routes to School. It's 8 a.m. on Sunday. I encourage people to come out and participate in one of the three runs, either the 5K for adults, the 1 mile for 8 and up, or the quarter mile for anybody. And the Historic Tacoma House and Garden Tour is on that same day, Sunday, May 3rd, from 1 to 5. If you have not already purchased tickets, you can do so at Jackie Park the day of the tour. 11 wonderful houses on historic Block 69, which is the block between Tacoma, Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia. So I encourage everyone to come out.
Okay. Are there any public comments? Does the city manager have any comments?
Sure. I just have two quick items. I wanted to share with the council that the finance director notified me yesterday that the city has been awarded the Certificate of Achievement for Excellence in Financial Reporting for the fiscal year ended June 30th, 2008. This will be the third year in a row that the city has received that certificate from the Government Finance Officers Association.
Does it come with like a bean counter trophy or something like that, or no?
It is the ultimate bean counter trophy. Thank you very much.
Way to put a name on it.
But a well-respected
Very well respected.
accomplishment.
Right.
You had a comment, Bruce?
I-
Can I add it? Sure. Are you done?
No, I had one more thing. The only other thing I just wanted to share with the council is this is the time of year where we go through and do the calculations to figure out how many residents would benefit from the city's local supplement to the state tax credit. Finance Department has finished those calculations this year. So I wanted to share with the council that there will be 170 homeowners this year benefiting from that program, and a total of $153,873 will be expended. So just wanted to share that with you.
Thank you.
That's it.
And just to clarify, that's for people applying with income qualifications for the...
Right, there's, I don't remember all the eligibility criteria, Councilmember Wright. There are some income qualifications. There's also some caps on the assessed value.
Great, thanks.
Councilmember Clay.
I forgot that it's my anniversary today, and it's the 15th anniversary of the first time I got married, before it was legal to get married. And so I wanted to say happy anniversary to Karen, since I won't get to see her again this year, because last year we had the final meeting of the Long Branch Sligo traffic calming on my anniversary, so I'm 2 for 2 here. You're dreaming.
Yeah. It's up to us. Our next item is the work session, budget work session item on the speed camera fund, and we have the chief, and I'm never going to get the rank right.
Sergeant Skibicki,
Well, I was going to do Skibicki, but I wasn't sure about the rank.
who is our OIC in charge of our speed camera program.
Welcome, both of you, and enlighten us on speed camera.
If you would get your charts on your orange page, which shows you the amount of warnings. We started on the 15th of March, and we issued warnings through the 31st, and as you can see, the numbers are rather high. And then we went into violations starting April 1st, with plenty of notification to the public, good TV coverage, and unlike some jurisdictions, we got a lot of support for what we're doing because of the area, which I think has helped our program quite a bit. And I don't know whether you're getting any negatives, but I'm getting a lot of support as I go to different community meetings. People seem to be really pleased that they're out there because it is slowing traffic down. Obviously, there's a few people that haven't got the word yet. To try to explain our program and as it compares to what's going on in Montgomery County, Rockville, and Gaithersburg, if you go to the second page and look at the numbers also and see the numbers for Ethan Allen, that's basically what has been in most programs, the normal numbers you get on roads in Montgomery County and in Gaithersburg and in Rockville. Needless to say, New Hampshire Avenue is probably at this point the most tickets being issued, and it's because it's a road where there are people coming down hills, going up hills, and it's the problem we've had for years there. They just speed on that road. Now we are seeing a decline in the numbers, and but they haven't gone down that much, as you can see. It'll take probably 2 to 3 months before we get an idea what the normal will be. And I know Barb, when she figured the numbers, did it on the more conservative side, taking into account that they're definitely going to go down. I think you see the numbers on Ethan Allen. I think they're going to be fairly consistent. I've been told in talking to the Rockville City Chief, who has a lot of streets similar to us, that some of the numbers get really low, and in some points you really think you've won the battle, so to speak. And that would be our obvious goal, that we get no violations. Now, that has not occurred anywhere yet, but the violations do go down. So it's still early in the program, so we're not sure just where we're going with it, but these give you some idea of the numbers. And like I said, the revenue numbers are conservative. Now, there has been a change in the law, and I think you've been informed of that. We did look at the numbers as they stand now and how they will when we go to 12 miles over. There'll be based on the numbers we have right now, there'd be about a 30% reduction in tickets based on going to 12 miles over. So that's something to keep in mind, and we will do that in October. Till October, we will continue with these numbers. That's when the new law goes into effect. And basically, that's an overview. I'm open to any questions, and obviously the sergeant knows the nuts and bolts of our program and looks at these violations every day, but we're open for questions and comments.
If I can just check one question that has come up that I wasn't sure of the answer to. I know that I believe that I know that I'll rephrase that. I believe I'm correct in understanding that the equipment is calibrated every day?
Not every day. Most places do it 1 to 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. If it's raining, we're not going out there because someone from Montgomery County got shocked by the button that does the calibration. But when you do the deployment log, and it's an end deployment log, you do it first, and then you do a start and deployment log. Both of them, you're checking the calibration. If it doesn't come up between 36, 37, or 38, we shut the thing down until they can fix it. And we haven't had a problem with it doing anything but 37 miles an hour so far.
Okay, and who does the calibration?
It's just a button you push inside. It's all computerized. We have what they call a GUI, which is some kind of a fancy name for a handheld, like little computer that plugs in. You push the button, it comes up, it gives you exactly what it was calibrated at. The original calibration for the antenna and all that is done by a company hired by ACS. So if something happens and it doesn't reach the calibration point that it's supposed to be, the whole thing's shut down, the antenna is pulled, another antenna will be put in temporarily, and that one will be sent out and get fixed.
And so you know that in court, this comes up periodically, and there's been no problems in court with calibration on the equipment so far. Judges, the system that's in place that he just explained to you has been upheld by the courts, and no ticket's been thrown out because of something like that.
Okay. Questions? Councilmember Robinson.
I think I answered it by looking at these two charts. The first one is warnings in the first 3 weeks, and then you went to citations starting week 4. And the second one, and that's for both Ethan Allen and
That's the
New
total
Hampshire.
figure.
That's the so the first page is the total, and the second page is a breakout for the two
Correct.
streets. Right. Okay, that's all I needed to know.
Councilmember Wright.
Is there any information about which direction the speeding's, because the cameras take pictures both ways, right? Do we have any data on the directions?
I can get that for you if you want it, but the most violations that we're getting are northbound New Hampshire Avenue. I thought it was going to be southbound, and I was totally wrong. It's northbound.
Everybody's in a hurry to get home.
I guess they're beating southbound by at least 300 a day.
Well, it's even more downhill, right? It's like right at the bottom of the
Well, see, that's what they were saying, but if you actually ride down it, before you hit the cameras, you're coming to the bottom of the hill, and it flattens. So you got a little ways to go in the flat area before you hit the cameras, because you're actually passing the cameras before they go off, because they have to take the picture of the rear of your car, not the front.
Right. And then the second question is kind of a funny pattern where this kind of up and down pretty, vacillates.
Well, I can probably explain that for you.
Yeah.
If I went out 7 days a week and did the deployment logs, the numbers would come down, but we did it based on a weekly average, and I don't go check them every day. So instead of having the numbers being smaller, because I did it every day, we broke it up weekly, and sometimes we didn't check it like 2 or 3 days, and one time we had a problem with the computer that ACS gave us, so it was like 5 days. So we had a big spike then, but it's staying basically the same all the way along. It's just that when you hit a week where we haven't checked it for a few days, you get a bigger spike.
Okay. Thank
It
you.
appears to be, Councilman Wright, it appears to be pretty consistent on a daily basis. And we're going to break it down further as we get into it. We've asked for more staff. We want to break it down by hour, see what's going on at night and things like that. But that's something we'll be looking at.
Councilmember Stevens.
Thank you, Mayor. Chief, you said you didn't know if we were getting any complaints about them, but you don't get many complaints. Of course, the complaints we hear are that we only approved this so that we could generate revenue, which, as you know, wasn't the discussion at the time and wasn't the reason that we passed this. The other complaint that I've gotten from several people really was how could we be so stupid to put these on Ethan Allen because nobody can speed on there, the road's so terrible. So,
Take a look at the numbers.
yeah, and I guess we're not only slowing people down with the speed cameras, but I'm sure they're going to the body shop or the auto shop more often, too. You mentioned that we're not going to implement the 12-mile-an-hour over until October. Is there a reason not to do that now?
Yeah, the law won't be in effect till October, and all the jurisdictions will switch over at the same time. In other words, the law is effective. What they
That's
do
when
is
we have to do it, but we could do it earlier,
we
right?
could do it earlier, but the way the program's set up with the courts, everybody is being consistent in what they do in the speeding, and it was agreed upon by all the jurisdictions after consulting with the courts. We work very closely with the courts on this, and we're going to make the change in October.
Thank you.
Councilmember Robinson.
Last thing, the totals on between the two charts, I'm the numbers guy here, if you haven't figured that out.
We have, sir.
I could have used you this morning.
Are off on weeks 4, 7, and 8 for starters. The second one tallies to 2,000, and the first one tallies to 1,300. The second one on week 7 tallies to 3,300, and the first one is 4,400. The second one's 41 and 35, so there's no pattern there. But you might, if I've got it right, you might check that.
Which chart are you looking at?
Well, on week 4, for example, on the first page, it says 1352.
Right.
Week 4. If you go to week 4 on the second page, it tallies to 2,027. So you add them together. So it's about 700 off. I don't know which one's right.
Okay, week 4 on the first page is just actual citations, not the warnings. We started it at like 1 minute after midnight on April 1st. And for the day before that, it was all warnings being given out. So where you see the red lines, that's your actual citations.
Okay, but if you look at week 7,
Go back a second.
week 7 on the first page is 4,400. But if you tally up on the second page, the 3144 and the 232, it comes to 3,300. So that's off by about 1,100.
Okay, that could be where when ACS, they do 2 checks on the citations before we actually get them, and sometimes they don't get them all back from MBA at the exact same time, so they're mixed in different areas. So I'm taking numbers off the machines plus the numbers that ACS has given me. So sometimes they don't catch up with each other right off.
All right, well,
To give you an idea, we could take a total count. It's just a count, then it goes to ACS, and then they figure out which ones are valid violations for us to review. They can eliminate some because the picture's messed up or for some reason something didn't come out right. Then when we get it, it's for our review for court. So that's where the breakdown would be. There could be a change in numbers. We hadn't thought about that when we gave it to them.
well, some of these match and some don't. So all I'm saying is be careful when you bring us
Yeah, we
numbers
will.
if the numbers don't match for the two charts.
And I heard a question from one constituent who is sure that he saw the camera flash at him, but he hasn't gotten his ticket. And so I was wondering about the time frame of how long it takes for the tickets to go out.
Once the flash goes off, we have 14 days to get the citation mailed. If they get it 15, 16 days later, it's up to the post office. But
But it has to go. It has to be processed and go to the post office.
that's correct. And
within
if we don't get it done within the 13th day, it gets wiped out, and we can't collect it. So we make sure we're getting them done at the right amount of time, and then the 14th day, they're mailed out.
And again, I think Chief's point earlier that some of the pictures don't come out, so yeah, you may just get lucky.
Right. If there's a glare on the tag, we're not going to do it. If you can't read the tag perfectly, we're not going to do it. And sometimes there's human error involved where we had one where ACS person put the thing through, but we caught it where the tag came back on a Lexus or something, and it was a Volkswagen that was sitting there. So we wiped it out.
So you review each and every tag, each and every picture?
Yeah.
I see.
This program, to keep its integrity and what has worked so good with the courts is these tickets, when they go to court, they've been reviewed at least twice, and obviously a law enforcement official has the final say before it goes there. And they've developed a good reputation. Actually, they tell them at the beginning of court, you get about 21, 30 people there, and they explain to them what they're going to do and what's allowed in court, and generally there's only 1 or 2 that go to trial. They quickly leave the courtroom and go pay the tickets. So the program, I think the best part is we waited here in Tacoma Park and took our time and did it for all the right reasons, which I continue to tell people, and I think people believe us. It's not a revenue thing. It's a lot of work, I'll tell you, but to build it right, and we were able to copy what our municipalities were doing and what the county's done, and we've come in at a good time. It's a strong program. The courts, we spent a lot of time with the judges, and they worked with us on this, and they meet with us to make sure that we're doing everything right. And I have a lot of confidence in what we're doing, and we are doing the right thing.
Good. Councilmember Wright.
Are we also discussing the financial aspect of it?
Yes.
This is not just, right, so, I had a question, do we have any sense of like what technically qualifies for use of the funds? Like, could you say that,
Fixing a bridge?
fixing a bridge creates safety for pedestrians and vehicular traffic, which would be different than paving a road, I think?
Yeah, we've actually had some internal discussions about that.
Well, what we did was we asked Senator Raskin's office to request an opinion from the Attorney General's office.
Okay.
Specifically on that question. What can count? And we asked the question, can a bridge count? We've been told that the Attorney General's office will be looking at that question next week. I'm not sure exactly how fast we'll get the turnaround, but it sounds like maybe by the end of next week or the following week.
Particularly maybe if we were going to widen the bridge or something, because it's such a narrow bridge where cars might.
And include a bicycle lane and a pedestrian lane, yeah.
Or fix the pieces that are going to fall apart?
And hit the pedestrians on the path below,
That's right.
absolutely.
Yes.
No, I appreciate Councilmember Wright raising this issue. I would ask the council to maybe take a look at the bottom half of the original blue sheet in terms of what was assumed in terms of the expenditures for fiscal year 2010. Obviously, we don't have a really good sense of how many citations there are going to be. As the chief indicated, my hope is that this program will eventually be slowing people down and that the number of citations will fall. For budgeting purposes, I assume there would be 7,500 paid citations each month. As you'll note on the blue sheet, there is a contractually required payment to ACS, which is the vendor that all the jurisdictions in Montgomery County use, I believe, Chief. We are expecting, well, Sergeant Skibicki and another officer have been kind of carrying the load at this point. We do anticipate that we will need some help next year. The chief has proposed that we hire a civilian employee to basically assist with this program. As I understand it, that's very similar to what the other jurisdictions are doing.
We've actually got sergeant, corporal, and we have, anytime an officer gets injured, which seems to happen a lot, unfortunately. So we've had 3 officers actually doing it since we started.
One of the requirements of the law is that you cannot supplant existing expenditures. So, for example, we couldn't take Sergeant Skibicki's salary and just move it over to the speed camera fund. It does allow us, however, to hire staffing that would be new specifically for this program. Some other things that we had assumed in terms of possible expenditures is about $500,000 for the design and installation of sidewalks, $100,000 for neighborhood traffic calming projects, $100,000 for yet to be identified capital, and then, as I mentioned, $92,000 for personnel. A portion of that is for a civilian employee to be hired. As I mentioned, it was also anticipated that we might spend about $40,000 in staff overtime for traffic details, things of that nature. One of the concerns is obviously that someone doesn't just slow down to avoid the camera and then hit the gas and create a speeding problem beyond the camera's range. This is very kind of tentative. I think this may be an area that the council doesn't necessarily need to talk about tonight and make a decision, but I think once we actually start getting any revenue being received and we have a better sense of the number of citations, council may want to revisit this proposed budget, and certainly we can do budget amendments or whatever else you'd like to do.
And for any of the personnel costs, are there any that will be anticipated to be, I don't know, permanent, ongoing costs? And the reason I'm asking that is that it sounds like there's the potential that, depending on how the I can't think of the right word, I'll say the recall petition, but the process whereby they might put the question of speed cameras on the ballot, how successful that is seen to be, and the politics of the legislative session before an election. My understanding is that it's possible that the ability to have this whole program could potentially go away sooner rather than later. And I'm just wondering about the kind of any of the personnel involved with it, and how that would play out if that were to occur.
Well, all I can do is what we're being told, and we go to a lot of meetings. We meet as jurisdictions every 2 weeks to go over everything. I think the legislation that was passed, and it was well debated, as you well know, because we had discussed it, and it took 2 years to get through. It doesn't really, I think it minimally affects what's on there, because there is a cap on revenue, which was led. But, I mean, if the program went away, then the personnel would go away. I mean, we would have a small, I mean, I look at the other jurisdictions, how many people they've got. There's quite a few people. I'm told that they don't think a recall would win, but, you know, that's...
My sense was that it might not even get to that.
Well, that's true. I mean, we know it's out there. That hasn't really been discussed with us at the meetings as a concern that the jurisdictions would look at this point. I think raising it to 12 and some of the other things they've put on it, the legislation came out of a lot of concerns to certain jurisdictions and what they may have done, and I think you know what I'm talking about. But I think by going the way we went, I think we've done it the right way, and I haven't heard a lot of complaints. I think most people look at New Hampshire. I think they'd be shocked to see what's going on Ethan Allen, because when we did the study, it did justify it, and nothing's changed. And I agree, there is a lot of construction, but they fly into the city and they fly out on that road, especially early morning hours, late night hours, and believe it or not, even during the day. So we feel the locations we're working should help reduce accidents, and that's obviously the goal. Just so you know, we've checked, since they've been up, there have been no accidents at any of the locations as a result of the cameras, which is a concern of a couple neighbors we've talked to, because they always hear the brakes slide, and you hear it on Ethan Allen a little bit more than you will on New Hampshire. But so far, no accidents as a result of the cameras.
I also know that the MML has added a session on speed cameras at the convention this year.
I mentioned that to the city manager. If she needs me to go to Ocean City again, I'll be more than glad to do it.
And I know that session is going to be on June 30th in the late morning. Yes.
I guess just two other points I just want to make. One of the things, and I think we'll have to get a better sense as this budget develops, is certainly, depending on the volume of sidewalk work that the council may decide to undertake, is in all likelihood we will need to hire some engineering assistance. And talking about that with the Public Works Director, we would probably do that on a contractual basis, basically just hire a firm to basically help with the design, perhaps do some construction oversight. It would certainly far exceed the ability of our one-four city engineer. The only other thing I just wanted to make sure the council was aware of with the bill that was approved by the legislature is that municipalities will be allowed to retain 10% of, essentially we can calculate 10% of our overall city revenues. That amount can be utilized by the city, and that's calculated net of any administration or implementation of the program. Anything that would exceed that 10% figure must be remitted to the state.
Sorry, say that again.
Essentially, we can, Councilmember Robinson, calculate our administration costs for the program, so it would be the payment to ACS, any staff that we have. So that kind of comes off the top. Whatever revenue then remains, the city can utilize 10% of that. Anything in excess of that, of our total revenues.
For this program?
Yes. It was part of the speed camera legislation passed.
So if our total revenue is $30 million as a city, I'm not saying it is,
Right.
then we could use $3 million of
Correct.
the net above
Net,
our administrative
right.
costs, and anything above that we would have to give back to the
Right, right. And one of the questions, I was in touch with some of the research staff at MML, because as I read the legislation, there's sort of a circular logic of how do you define what your total revenues are if you're counting speed camera revenues as part of that calculation, but that's what the legislation's silent, so presumably total is total. There also isn't really any guidance in the legislation about at what point do you do that, because obviously you don't really have final figures for the fiscal year until it's done and your audit is completed. Once again, there's really no guidance in the law about the timing. We can certainly kind of maybe pursue that and get some guidance from the Attorney General's office. Our presumption at this point is that we should probably be somewhat judicious in terms of the outflow of money. We wait until we have audited expenditures, which probably wouldn't be until several months after the fiscal year, and then presumably we would make the remittance to the state probably sometime in late summer or early fall. But there's a lot of
If we got
unknowns
to
in the
that point,
legislation.
And at this point, we don't anticipate getting to that point.
I don't think so either, but I think there's just, what I would hate to see is us go gangbusters and spend a whole lot of money and find out, oops, we spent money based on the budget, and then we end up having to, yeah.
I mean, we don't even have our first month revenue
Right.
yet. So, I mean, what you're seeing is what took a picture of, what we processed. Now the question is how many people pay. And that is a big issue in the program, getting people to pay. And that's something we work on. We're learning as we go to these meetings continually. That's a part of the program, too. Not everybody pays their ticket. It's hard to believe, but it does happen.
What happens if they don't? I'm trying to help my colleague.
I paid it the day I received it.
Well, what happens is if they don't pay it within the first 30 days, there's a $25 fee tacked on by ACS. And it's some kind of processing fee. They have the right to call ahead of time or send in their little form and go to court, and that alleviates any fees until after court. But if they fail to go to court or call to say they want to go to court and they fail to do anything after the $25 is added on, their tag is flagged. When the ACS flags a tag, they're charging them $20 to do that, and MBA is charging them $30 to unflag it once they pay the ticket.
And if it's flagged and nothing else happens, they can't renew their registration?
That's correct, until the citation's in, all the fees are paid. So to get it unflagged, they're paying $30. So it's just adding up for a $40 ticket that weighs no more than a parking ticket. It's no points attached to their driving record or anything like a regular speeding ticket would be. And like some of the speeds we've gotten on New Hampshire Avenue, that would cost them in the $200-300. And it's a $40 ticket.
What speeds have we been getting on it?
Well, we've hit 60s. We got 2 cars at 61 on Ethan Allen, which is 25 miles an hour. I mean, it's...
Because I know that in Chevy Chase, they've gotten cars at 11 in the morning going 100 down Connecticut Avenue.
I haven't reached one that high yet. When I get it, I'll put it in your mailbox. Because I'm sure I'll get it.
They're also looking at going after them from a credit standpoint. That's being discussed, and apparently by law they can do that. So they are working very hard. Of course, they don't get a cut unless the ticket's paid, and obviously they're not doing this. It's for a profit company. But I would tell you one of the arguments is because we use the company. The company is works with the jurisdictions very well, works with the courts. Obviously, the goal is to get people to pay the tickets, and they're working hard to do that.
I hate to think that we're all trying to avoid the budget discussion, but I had one more question. That is, I know that a gentleman in Bethesda had sued the state over this. Do you know what the status of that is?
Yeah, we get updated. They sued Chevy Chase in Montgomery County, but everybody that was in the program at that point, we're not in the suit so far. So far they've done discovery. I can only tell you what they're reporting us. They do not expect the judge to let it go even to trial, that it may be dismissed before that. That's what they're saying at this point, but you know how that is. We'll just have to wait and see. But they provided all the discovery. The issues that they've raised have been addressed because we've discussed the issues within our working group, and we don't see, because obviously we're looking not to do anything to put ourselves in jeopardy, and from what I'm gathering from the courts and the judges, they don't see this going any further.
Councilmember Snipper, are you there?
I am here, and I haven't had any questions. You guys have asked all of my questions, and the city manager and chief have answered other ones that I had. So I'm perfectly happy to let you guys continue doing that.
Okay, I just want to make sure you hadn't fallen asleep.
No, not falling asleep at all.
Councilmember Wright.
Just to make sure that people are aware, because there was questions related to the license plate scanner. It's not taking pictures unless someone's speeding, so it's only taking a picture and recording the license plate if someone's speeding, correct?
That is correct.
Great, thanks.
It does record how many passes, but it doesn't take a picture. Because Ethan Allen was kind of surprising, because in one day you'll get 20,000 cars going on one side of Ethan Allen. And that surprised me when I saw it. You figure it's just a little teeny street and it doesn't get that much traffic, but it does.
I would have said 10,000.
Yeah, twice.
20,000 one way on Ethan Avenue. How many on New Hampshire?
Oh, New Hampshire's outrageous. It can be, in one day, 30, 35,000 cars.
One way. But still, that means Ethan Allen's half as traffic as
We all know how it backs up in the morning and in the afternoon. There's a lot of traffic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next item is the discussion of the Community Center Fund.
Good evening. This should be fairly straightforward. The Community Center Fund for FY 2010 has to do with the renovation of this room, the auditorium. The funds are all coming from state and federal funds, as well as $150,000 from Washington Venice Hospital. As you know, a large percentage of the funding is coming from program open space funds. We held off on going out to bid while the state legislature debated program open space funds, and I want to just take one moment to acknowledge that our lobbyists did a wonderful job keeping this issue before the key people, and the mayor was there in many different ways trying to facilitate that, and so I really appreciate their work. The use of program open space funds for indoor use was approved as it's been used for 40-some years, and so processing can proceed. For FY 2010, the fiscal impact we're projecting is just over $1 million. The total cost of the project is about $1.39 million, which includes some of the costs being spent on design during this year and some of the initial work. Of that, we had started and designed this facility, did the design work based on a $1.2 million budget. As you know, Congressman Van Hollen was able to secure $190,000 towards this project. With that, the architects were instructed to look at what things could be done to get greater energy efficiency for this room, or other kinds of things that they felt, if indeed the bids came in at a reasonable price and there were some additional funds, that we would be able to accomplish some of our other goals, especially related to improving our ability to reach LEED standards for this room. The couple things that they're looking at are a different approach to the HVAC system. There's several different ways to approach that, and right now the engineers are reviewing some information. So there's been just a slight delay until next week on moving forward while they decide on which HVAC system makes the most sense to use for this. They're also doing some speculation on costs of going to geothermal for part of this building. That's a very expensive process, but there may be some other efficiencies for the city that are worthwhile. They're not spending a lot of time on that investigation, but there may be some things that I'll bring back to you that look of interest. One of the other energy efficiencies, the modes that we were looking at, was using photovoltaic panels to reduce the energy cost for this building. I just want to mention that because of the delay in the decisions on the program open space funds and this last week or so discussion on the mechanics of the HVAC systems, it looks like we'll have this auditorium available for use through June 26th, and that it probably then, it might be until January 11th before it's completely open and furnished and occupiable. As soon as we get a contractor on board, we'll have a more specific construction schedule, but I wanted to give you that update given the delay with the legislature. As I said, there's no direct city funds in this project. Every indication is that we're on budget and that the estimates have come back within the budget.
I have two quick things. One is I wanted to give a particular call out to Senator Raskin and his help on the program open space funding. He
and his staff are great.
Invaluable in making sure that happened
Right.
as it needed to.
Right, and the biggest issue was in the Senate,
Yeah.
on this issue.
And he and I worked very closely to get everything worked out.
Thank you.
And I also wanted to just, you brought up something about possibility of geothermal, because I don't remember when it was, but some time back we had thought that we could go to geothermal for a lot of this building, and actually had people out there drilling trying to do it, and they were unsuccessful because they couldn't get through the bedrock in the back.
All I know is that in the discussions, Darrell Braithwaite felt that it was a worthwhile thing to do this initial investigation. So they perhaps have some other thoughts on that. And we had gotten some input from community members about that. It's worth, like I said, it may not be worth a lot of time investigating, but it certainly is worthwhile for us to pursue what might be involved.
Yeah, because a city council in the past decided it was a good idea, and efforts were expended and money was expended, and there was a rig in the parking lot trying to make it happen, and we gave up.
Well, one of the things I will say is that when we've done a variety of different kinds of test pits for different purposes, like the gymnasium study and all of that, the area in the back varies tremendously.
So it's not drill, baby, drill.
No. Councilmember Stevens.
I was just going to mention that I believe there's a geothermal project going on right now in Ward 4, and right along the same ledge. Maybe we can learn from their experience.
That's the Franklin.
Yes.
Yeah,
I've
that's
seen
right.
I've seen the rig.
That's
Yeah.
right.
The trouble is you can move 20 feet and you're not on the same ledge.
Right.
Councilmember Wright.
Is the green roof project in the community center fund, or is that in a different part of the?
It's in a different fund.
Is that a
However,
special
we are
revenue fund?
planning on using it as part of the LEED certification. That is part of how we're addressing green issues on the building.
It was originally, we had originally hoped that we would be able to undertake that project this year, which is why you don't see it anywhere in the budget. As we go through the reconciliation process, I just ran out of time this evening, we focused on the general fund. You will be seeing a reconciliation item in the special revenue fund, basically reflecting the stimulus funding that we received and the associated expenditure.
Any other questions on the community center fund? Councilmember Snipper, do you have any questions on the community center fund?
No, I do not. You guys have again asked all my questions.
I have one.
Councilmember Wright.
I just would like for us to get updates, particularly on those green features, if there's financial implications where we would need to make a decision to
Absolutely.
spend more or something like that. I would hate to have us make a decision on something like the photovoltaics if we need to spend a little bit more to do that. I'd be open to doing that. So I just would hope we can have a back and forth about
Oh, absolutely. In fact, what we've learned so far is that the one thing that we have to make a decision on pretty much now is the HVAC system, because that goes into the base bid documents. Most of the other kinds of significant energy savings, like from the photovoltaics, can be done as a separate project in combination with this. Would be bid separately. So what will happen is we'll receive our bids on this project. We'll then know what money we have. Then we'll look at the options for the other energy savings projects, and we may make a decision, especially if it's something that doesn't just affect this room, but affects more of the community center, if it's worth some additional funding. I'll bring all those options to you.
And I remember something about the possibility that the number of bids that we might receive on this project might exceed what was anticipated in the contract with the consultants. Has there been any more about that? Will that affect anything in terms of what might need to be amended to the consultant's contract that would affect
We still
total
actually have to
budget?
make a decision about the approach on that. It's a fairly minor decision. There's two approaches about how to go forward. Each of them has a small cost implication, and we'll need to decide what to do with that, if indeed there's quite a few bids. You know, we may get a really good market where lots of people bid on it. We may not, because we're asking for a fairly significant amount of lead experience. And so it's a little bit of an open question right now.
But no matter what, the budget implication isn't very big.
That's correct.
But that scares me, because one person's not very big is another person's, gosh, that's a lot of money. Do you have any idea how much you're talking
We're
about?
talking $3,000 or less.
Okay, thank you.
I think it was anticipated, how many, it was that they would review
They
up
would
to
review
like
6.
6
And they are not going to be picky about that. If there's 8 or 10, they're not going to
Right.
they're not going to change their budget for that.
But the sense was, depending on the economy at a particular point in time and the attraction of bidding on projects, depending on contractors' availability, they thought they might get as many as 30 responses, but who knows?
Who knows?
Any other questions on the community center? Thank you. And our final item for this evening's budget work session is the reconciliation process. And I think what I'd like to do first is ask the city manager to just go through some of the fairly substantial information that she's put together. And I don't know how many people had a chance to look at it when it was emailed out at 5 o'clock this afternoon, but I think it would be good to go over it, and so we're working from a common knowledge.
You would like me just to walk through kind of what's here?
Yes.
Okay. What I tried to do, there were certain items during the budget process that the council had requested additional information on, and then there were some just other items that, truthfully, we thought we should share additional information on. Included in your supplemental packet this evening, I believe I emailed this to you all yesterday, were a copy of the organizational charts for each department, including the full-time equivalents associated with each of those. Would certainly be happy to answer any questions about that. We have also included in the packet, which is at the back of it, where things stand in terms of the general fund reconciliation items, at least to date. There is one reconciliation sheet for general fund revenues. As a reminder, following the submittal of my proposed budget, the state did reduce highway user revenues to all the governmental jurisdictions. The impact of that was a loss of just under $57,000 from what is in your proposed budget. I've also included an expenditure reconciliation sheet as of today, which is the very last page of this packet. Hopefully I have captured everything accurately from the council's discussion on Monday evening. There was one item which I did not have a figure for. I do have a copy of the letter that you all received from Liz Lerman Dance Exchange, essentially requesting funding. I did not see any dollar amount in that correspondence, so that's just sort of an unknown. Did want to just provide one update on this, which was we received after this information was prepared. In regard to the employee health insurance, as you may recall, we assumed an 11% rate increase when the budget was submitted. We unfortunately found out after that the carrier has initially proposed a renewal rate of 19.8%. The difference between those two figures has an associated cost of $102,000, which is what is reflected on this reconciliation list. Earlier this evening, I was advised by the broker that Aetna has now revised that figure to 17%. So it's made some progress. It is highly unlikely, in my opinion, that we will be able to get down to 11% without some changes in our benefit structure. And the Deputy City Manager and I have been talking to the city's 2 bargaining units about that, most recently earlier this afternoon with ASME. Those discussions are continuing. Also included in your agenda packet are a number of items regarding various personnel-related issues. In listening to the council comments Monday night, I can certainly appreciate the council's interest and concern. This is the largest % of the city's budget, so obviously it's an area that the council would probably be extremely interested in. I guess just speaking as your manager, I do feel that there needs to be a balance between what we do for our employees and what we are expecting the taxpayers to pay for those services. I think for those of you that I've worked with for my tenure here, which has been almost 5 years now, I'm not a manager who comes to you all and basically asks for increases in staff. I do that very reluctantly, and I think most of the department heads probably can painfully attest to that, as some of them are nodding with a grimace on their face. What I have tried to do, and I believe my predecessors at the city have also done, is try to look at how positions can be restructured, in some cases reduced, and I have certainly done that in my own department during my time here. Having said that, I do think there's a point at which we need to align what our staffing resources are with what the council's expectations and what the community's expectations are. And certainly I think as the council is willing to adjust those, that warrants a review of our staff. I think one of my obligations both to the council and to the staff, however, is there's a point at which we cannot do quality work if we keep taking on more and more demands and we're not appropriately staffed to handle that. And ultimately, I think those level of services are a decision that the council has to make and to communicate to me. As a service industry, obviously everything we do flows through our staff. I think just as I think it's a mistake for cities to basically not keep up their capital infrastructure, I think it's also a mistake for governments not to maintain your human infrastructure. If you do not have an appropriate benefit structure, an appropriate salary structure, and all we do is become a revolving door, that has consequences for the services that we provide to this community. And that's part of the reason why the council undertook the compensation and salary study. I guess it started back in fiscal 08 and was presented to the council in early March. What I've included in your packet, because I was interested on my own, was to contact Jill Pilot from Slavin Management, who was the individual who presented the results of the compensation and classification study in March. Included in your packet was a memo that she sent to Karen Hampton and myself about what is the consequence of not actually implementing that study. And I think, as you may recall from Ms. Pilot's remarks, we had not done a study in 10 years. What she found in the marketplace was that there were basically adjustments that had to be made, or she recommended be made, certainly in several classifications. And I think the results of that study were borne out with some of the turnover we have seen in certain areas of the city. And I think when you have the opportunity to review Ms. Pilot's memo to us, she very strongly urges the council, if you do nothing else, to basically move forward with implementing the results of the study. We have not brought that forward to you all. We do have discussions that we need to have with the city's bargaining units, and we're hoping that those will conclude soon and that we will be in a position to bring those revised pay ordinance before the council, hopefully later in May. The other thing I would just remind the council just generally is we do have provisions in both of our bargaining agreements regarding how market adjustments will be made on an annual basis. I think, as the council is aware, we look at the Employment Cost Index, which is a Department of Labor index every December. That essentially sets the market adjustment rate for the subsequent fiscal year. Those are basically contractual provisions, and certainly I can appreciate the concern that has been raised, but I would caution this council about even contemplating not abiding by those collective bargaining agreements. Earlier this evening, I did provide the council with a memo from the city attorney about that, and you can certainly review that and ask any questions. But those are agreements that we have entered into. I think our employees have a right to expect us to abide by them. And I think certainly any concerns the council may have about the provisions of those agreements, such as the floor that was talked about quite a bit on Monday evening are things that both the Deputy City Manager and I have noted as issues to be raised with the unions as those agreements come up for renewal.
And is there, can you share with us the timing of those, because they tend to be multi-year?
Yeah, we normally try to have at least 3-year agreements. The agreement with Local 400, which is the bargaining unit that represents most of our sworn police officers, was just entered into just about a year ago. So I believe it probably has 2 more years, and I think the ASME agreement has another year, I believe.
Beyond that, or just 1 year?
Next year's ask.
Yeah, the ASME agreement, I believe, expires in 2010, June 30th.
And the labor agreements tend to, I don't know whether this is by practice or whether it's particular language that basically says whatever one union gets, the other union gets. Pardon?
There are
I know they differ, but there tends to be a kind of a linkage there.
Well, certainly what will happen if one union is aware of a provision in another agreement,
They'll bring it up.
they will bring it up. I mean,
Okay.
they certainly talk.
So
But there's not,
they're
there's nothing.
bargained individually, there's nothing
Yes,
formal, but.
there is no trigger between the two.
That's right.
Sorry.
But the unions can voluntarily agree to make concessions to their contract, like was done at Montgomery County, right? They
Correct.
did to not take COLAs, to
Right.
reduce the number of layoffs, so that overall everyone in the union was better off.
Correct.
right?
That is really the process that we are going through and talking about making adjustments in the health insurance structure. There are, the language in both those agreements relative to certain benefits is different. I think just as a matter of course, regardless of whether some of these things are contractually required or not, I think it's just good practice as an employer to try to work out any issues cooperatively with the hope that we can all sort of see the bigger picture, which is to avoid layoffs, avoid furloughs, and that's what I communicated to ASME when we were meeting earlier today.
And if I could just get one clarification on the assumptions around the classification study, that, am I correct that all of your budget assumes that the classification study is approved by the council in this fiscal year, and that kind of populates into any assumptions that you've made about next
That is
fiscal year?
correct.
Councilmember Ray.
I just want to make a comment at some point during this session, and I think this is probably the right time to do it, because my understanding is that there's concern and our debate about positions, personnel positions, has created a bit of angst and agita for city staff. And I at least want to say personally, I think many of my council members probably agree that we apologize for the fact that we have to have this debate in public. You know, I've worked in business where I've had these same debates, and most of the time these debates take place behind closed doors among a small number of people when businesses are faced with tough economic times. Unfortunately, as the city, we're required to, in this particular area, have an open meeting about this. And that means that we have to air and discuss and debate and contemplate things in public, including very tough decisions that we take very seriously about the possibility of layoffs. And I guess I would say the only thing about that is that you know what we're truly thinking. I mean, a lot of people who work at businesses actually wish that those conversations were more transparent and public. And I guess one of the benefits is that the city staff does have that transparency. But I would say that I think about this a lot, and I'm trying to balance the needs of the city, the stresses that are put on the taxpayers, and also the employment of city employees that I think, frankly, do a very good job and work very hard in the part of the city, and we're very thankful for that. So I want to apologize again that we have to do it in public, but it's not a reflection on how we feel about you as individuals or your performance. Overall, I think we're very pleased and thankful that so many dedicated individuals work so hard for the city. But that's the reality of what we're faced with, and I hope that people can understand that.
And Councilmember Wright, I appreciate your comments. In fact, I think much of the sentiment of what I expressed to the Ask Me bargaining group earlier today was along those lines, that I shared with them the discussions that the council has had. I've also shared some of the comments that I have made with you all. And I think, speaking for myself, I think certainly I don't think there's anyone on the staff who doubts the regard that I hold them in. But just like the council, I do have a responsibility to try to balance what we are doing as an employer with our employees, and I do think there is an investment, as I mentioned, that needs to be made if we're going to continue to provide quality service, but that has to be balanced. And that, as I've shared with this council, you know, I struggle with the structure of our health insurance plan being as generous as it is, and that's coming from someone who's worked in government her entire career and has always thankfully had great health insurance coverage. But as I've shared with the bargaining unit today, I don't really feel in all good conscience that we need to do everything we can to try to bring that renewal rate in line with what is in this proposed budget, so that we are not going back to this council or to the taxpayers to ask them to make up that difference. And I think that's the discussion we are having with the bargaining units about trying to make some adjustments in co-pays and other things to try to get that cost down. So I appreciate your comments, Councilmember Wright, and I share them. And we've conveyed that to the union, that this is not a personal attack on the workforce. It's simply the council exercising its due diligence in terms of how tax dollars are being spent.
Can I ask a question? Do employees have the option to pay into pre-tax medical so that they can, in some ways, if there are increasing co-pays, that can be deferred, or not deferred, but can be softened a little bit by the pre-tax?
Yes, they do. It's a provision of the IRS code known as Section 125. We actually allow that in several areas. There's the health insurance, there's child care. Is that the three areas? Is that the two areas, Yvonne?
Those are the areas I know of.
Yeah, we are exploring perhaps, there are some things that we are exploring in terms of transportation. We're trying to get a sense of what the interest might be among employees, because there's certainly costs for the city in terms of administration. Is that okay if I?
Go ahead. When there's a break.
It was a chance to catch up on a couple of those first items, but on the other hand, I want to give you a chance to kind of go through what you've given us, so that, because I know in looking what's in here, there must have been a piece that came after 5 because I didn't see
Oh,
it.
yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I apologize, obviously. I got home around midnight on Tuesday and really tried my best to get things to you as quickly as possible, but there wasn't a lot of time between when the meeting ended Monday and this evening, so I apologize that you did not have more of an opportunity to kind of review this. We were trying to get it to you piecemeal.
And I heard it was coming in one lump, so I read the lump and then came down here for a 6:30 meeting, and I obviously missed something.
I was continuing to try to generate paper, Mayor Williams. One of the things that's included in here, and like I say, we may need to talk about some of this after you've had more of a chance to review it, but as I've shared with the council, one of the things that I like to routinely do is to sort of look at positions when they become vacant, and even with some of the ones that are listed in my memo of April 30th, where I personally feel those positions should be filled, I thought it might be helpful to share with the council what positions are currently vacant, a brief description of what those positions do, how much is included in the budget for them, what might be the consequence of not filling those positions, and certainly that's something we can talk about. I have advised the Human Resources Manager that I was preparing this information and pending the council having the opportunity to review it and perhaps have some discussion with me, that she is not authorized to make any employment offers for these positions. So I did want to give the council the flexibility to review this information and for us to have a discussion about what the service impacts might be, and to see if you had any thoughts about that. When you have more of an opportunity to review this, one of the things I did just want to specifically call to your attention, it's not currently on the reconciliation list, but we do have one of our crossing guard positions that is vacant. It is a kind of a swing position, and I did ask the chief and his staff to basically review, I guess an idea that I had is whether or not we really needed to fill that position, or if our nuisance abatement officer, who previously worked as a crossing guard and still occasionally fills in because I pass him usually on the corner of Philadelphia and Maple some days, whether there was an opportunity, given his work schedule, to not fill this swing crossing guard position and utilize the nuisance abatement officer in the morning and perhaps some other departmental staff in the afternoon. The chief and his staff did review it, think it was workable. And I do appreciate their willingness to kind of work with me on this. But it's the very last item on the memo about vacant positions. But my proposal to the council would be that we eliminate that vacant crossing guard position, address those duties as I've just mentioned, and that would result in a savings of just under $20,000. I didn't think the council would have a problem with our doing that, but that is something that I feel that we could probably do without having any impact on services to the community. One of the other things, as you have an opportunity to review this, and you'll see this throughout much of the material that you received this evening, is that there are certainly opportunities in some cases to not fill positions, eliminate positions that are filled at this time, and use either a series of part-time staff or contractual labor. There are downsides definitely to doing that, and I would also mention that's in conflict with a policy that a prior council adopted in 2007. So I think particularly as we go through the budget and we're talking about personnel-related issues, I guess part of what I need is guidance from the council in terms of how strongly you feel about that 2007 resolution that is on the books. It essentially binds what I do as a manager, and I think in the absence of the council reversing that policy, I think to some degree it creates a situation where you may want budgetary savings, but then you're violating your own policy.
What resolution is this referring to?
This was, I don't remember the exact number. This was a resolution the council had asked me to draft and that the council adopted in 2007, Councilmember Clay, that essentially says that you're not really interested in using contractual labor or part-time non-benefited positions unless it's absolutely necessary for operational reasons, that the council's intent is to provide benefits and to have work done in-house, essentially by in-house staff.
And I believe that came up in the context of.
It was during the budget process.
I remember.
Right.
Yeah.
And was there nothing in that resolution about, because the part of the conversation that was important to me was the job creation for people coming out of the community, like stepping stone jobs in recreation and in like gardens and
I believe
isn't that part of the resolution?
I believe it is. I can. I should remember, Councilmember Clay, because I think I drafted it with the council's input, but I can certainly provide you all with a copy of that. Anyway, I did just want to. That was one of the things as I was drafting this and trying to point out things to the council. I wouldn't say it's problematic, but I think there certainly may be a conflict there in some cases.
Councilmember,
I wasn't on the council at the time. I think I was sitting in the audience listening. I feel like I remember there was an aspect or the intention of that was that we weren't intentionally using part-time people to create two part-time jobs, for example, when you could have a full-time job, but that it was okay if the true duties of what we were asking somebody to do was a part-time position, to have a part-time position, but we shouldn't intentionally use part-time jobs or contractual labor
to avoid
having a full-time.
Right. That is
Avoid paying benefits.
right. That is the spirit of it. As I went through and analyzed many of the positions that are currently vacant, and once again, I apologize you haven't had the chance to review that, but you will note that as I was analyzing those vacancies and how those services could be provided, perhaps not at the same level, but essentially addressed, one option in many cases is to use part-time staff or contractual labor as a cost-saving measure. We put those numbers out there for you. Once again, I think that's a policy matter to a large extent for the council.
And if I can just remind everybody that kind of a place from a continuity of the concern about avoiding full-time benefited positions also came out of an earlier council's discussion of whether to outsource cleaning of all the buildings, and there was a unanimous decision at that point to offer full-time jobs with benefits.
Just very quickly, because I really want to get to see what questions the council has and hearing your discussion this evening. Just a few other things that are in the packet that the council may want to talk about is has been a lot of back and forth about the general fund and the appropriate level of unreserved fund balance. I had asked Yvonne if she could share her thoughts on that matter. There is a memo in the packet regarding that, and she can certainly answer any questions the council may have. I've also included in the packet some information I had asked the Public Works Director to prepare, because there's been a lot of discussion about the repairs needed to the two bridges. My specific question to Daryl and to the city engineer was, what is the consequence of not making those repairs in FY 2010? So there is some information included in the packet about that. If I could ask Susie, because she's been in discussion with the county, and I'd like her to share where the county is on this issue.
Yes, in our budget is the proposal that the city's fund, that $168,000 of the city funds would go to the bridge, with the expectation that Montgomery County would contribute $168,000 for the total cost of the immediate repairs for the two bridges. I was at the Transportation and Environment Committee meeting last Monday, where this subject came up. Only Nancy Florine and Roger Berliner were there. George Leventhal was not at that meeting. At that meeting, Glenn Orland, who's the legislative person, the staff for that committee, recommended that an option could be that the $168,000 could be provided to the city as a loan, which we would pay back over time. I had to call him back to clarify as after the discussion continued, because it was a little unclear how it ended. But basically, it would be $168,000 was recommended by the committee to place on the reconciliation list to be worked out as a loan between the city and the county, terms of which are to be discussed. Glenn gave the recommendation, or gave the example of a 10-year no-interest loan, as was done with Pinecrest, for a portion of the Pinecrest funds 10 years ago. But there was not a decision as to the payback time or whether or not interest would be included. I tried to make a pretty good case about how this isn't the same as road repair, that the municipal tax duplication payments are different for bridges and, in fact, do not pay for major work on bridges. I also indicated that I guess there was two references to the letter that Councilmember Urban and Councilmember Elrich had written recommending that the county allocate $84,000 per, up to $84,000 per bridge to assist with the work, but that if the city could get stimulus funds for the work, that it should come from that. Since that time, we've all learned that the city cannot get transportation stimulus funds, that those funds were distributed through the counties in Maryland. The county staff feels that either they use the funds for unincorporated Montgomery County projects, or they have to split it among the 22 municipalities in the county, and then nobody would get very much money. I have asked for a copy through one of the council members of the list of projects that the county does plan on submitting for their stimulus funding. If not, they've not seen that. I've not seen that. But I would very much be very interested in seeing where that stands on that list. The argument that I feel pretty strongly about is that there was an effort to expend the stimulus funds quickly with judgment as to higher priority projects, that it did make sense to not give it just out to a bunch of municipalities, provided they may not have projects ready to go, that the view at a county level might be useful, because they could look at a variety of projects and see which are ready to go, and that the county should live up to that responsibility and look across the county, irrespective of municipal boundaries, to determine which projects are appropriate and ready to go for those funds. I'm still hoping that that political case can be made by county council members and by you. But when I was asked, how does the city council feel about this loan provision, I said, gee, we just heard of it, because it came in late on Friday. There was not an opportunity. I was actually at a conference. There's not been an opportunity before this for you to discuss it and think about it. What I have been told is that the full county council will take this item up on Tuesday, May 5th. So if there is a position that the city council wishes to take about the $168,000 from the county or any other issue related to the bridges, it would be very useful for you to make that decision this evening, so that I've been requested to try to get a letter to the county council by noon tomorrow so it could be included in the package. Obviously, if it goes later, we send it later, but I said, gee, you know, city manager, in good faith, tried to come up, recognizing that, you know, the whole discussion of the tax duplication has not been settled yet, to put some funds forwards because this is a very serious project. And I hope that the county council would, you know, also take it in that seriousness. And I got a fairly receptive look from Nancy Florine, but the proposal from the committee is for the $168,000 on the reconciliation list as a loan.
Councilmember Wright, you're looking like you want to say something.
I think our letter should basically state that, start off by saying that the bridges are not something that we're fairly rebated for, that we've received no rebate for it, and it's a duplicative service, and the county should be paying, in my opinion, for full repair of the bridges. That what we would request is that the bridges go into the county process for assessing the state of bridges across the entire county, and
which we've been requesting for 2 years.
Which we've been requesting, that they go onto that list to be evaluated. And my understanding is they evaluate it based on structural integrity and state of the bridge, as well as the importance of the bridge related to its location and surroundings. They go onto that list and be prioritized based on the criteria that they use for every bridge in the county. And this is what George Leventhal said he was comfortable with. And then based on that, it goes into the queue and it's repaired in the order that that would come up. I realize there's an issue related to it technically not being eligible for CIP funds. I would say that we're happy to explore with them legal ways for us to transfer the ownership of those bridges to the county. I would not use the language of abandonment because I don't think that's what it is. I think it's a process by which we would transfer those to the county, and they would be responsible for those bridges like they're responsible for a bridge in any other part of the county. If they don't want to take ownership, they don't have to put it into the CIP, but they should just pay for the money to repair the bridges in full based on the order it comes up in.
Right, and there really are two issues, and even the county staff gets confused about this. One is that our first requests 2 years ago were for the regular major bridge rehabilitation that they are eligible for under federal bridge standards, which are fairly big projects and quite expensive. The $336,000 that we're talking about for FY 2010 are for immediate repairs, as described by Ms. Braithwaite, to make sure that the bridges are safe and to forestall further deterioration that would be very costly. Those immediate repairs are eligible for the ERA funds, the stimulus funds. The other projects are, you know, multi-years out. And so there's essentially two queues that we're talking about. One is the immediate queue for immediate work, perhaps with stimulus funds or other funds, and a different queue is for the major rehab work that they're eligible for in the CIP.
And they should go into both queues, and if it's the major, if it's the, basically what's will amount to replacement, right? My understanding is there's a 20% local match for that, right? The 20% local match should be paid for by the county, not by the city, because again, it's not something we're rebated for, and it's a duplicative service. It's not like people in Tacoma Park are saying, we want more bridges, like we're saying we might want more recreation staff or more library.
Our bridges are different.
Right.
We're not saying our bridges are different.
We don't want, it's not like we're asking for gold-plated bridges.
And if the point that I was going to make, you started to get to of the two tracks, and the fact that these are eligible for stimulus funding, and that a lot of the preliminary work has been done, and it's just the type of project that should go for stimulus funding. And my sense, and I think you have a better sense of it, is the process for qualifying projects for the stimulus funding are pretty rigorous and fairly quick, and that the county may have difficulty meeting the criteria for some of the things they might be thinking about, and this is the perfect project to be able to use stimulus funds.
Well, that's why I was very interested to see the list that they're contemplating.
And that many of the county council members were kind of preliminarily on board with, oh, and if you get stimulus funding, you know, this is the perfect place for it. So it's now just, well, yes, we'll get the stimulus funding if you make it eligible for it and apply it to this project. Councilmember Clay.
I still don't understand how the city can own bridges that are essentially on county property. The property.
Public rights of way often cross, parks and that kind of thing, and that's what the situation is.
And of course, the county council and the county executive will say that technically that's not county property, that's park and planning property, which is not the county council and the county executives under their purview. It talked to park and planning.
That's just annoying.
Well, yeah.
However,
that actually is
but they will make
a
that
phrase
point.
that's been used on this project.
I think we should just park a cruiser in the middle of each bridge and wait and see how long it takes them to decide that these bridges are critical to their operation. I mean, the people driving back and forth on Sligo Creek Parkway and who cut up through Flower Avenue are driving through our community to get to jobs and buy things in other parts of Montgomery County, to which all of the sales tax revenue from that and income tax revenue and all that is accruing to the county and not to us.
Yeah, I would like to say also that Jerry Stocks from Washington Adventist Hospital apparently is sending a letter to the county council urging that the Maple Avenue Bridge be dealt with because of the importance to the access to the emergency room at the hospital.
Well, his employees and the people who come to his hospital drive over the Flower Avenue Bridge, too, because they drive straight up Flower Avenue.
I understand that, but I'm just letting you know that that's my understanding, that they've sent a letter, and we haven't seen the copy yet, but it's apparently coming.
Yeah, that's the ambulance route bridge.
The Maple Avenue Bridge handles, obviously, ambulances. It handles several ride-on bus routes, school bus routes, and obviously quite a lot of other traffic. And they both bridges are on the Sligo Creek Parkway system.
Well, and right now, that bridge at Flower is not in condition. Ambulances and school buses and trash trucks are not supposed to drive over that bridge. It's not safe.
That's correct.
And from Ms. Braithwaite's memo, it seems fairly clear that the longer any repairs to these bridges are delayed, the more expensive they will get, kind of by geometric progression. Councilmember Wright.
I was just wondering if maybe we should put into the budget money for a position for toll collector.
All right.
I think the city manager missed that.
I'm
sorry. To create a position of toll collector.
And that could probably be the position that was just juggled with the parking enforcement and the nuisance officer and school crossing guard. The school crossing guard could go down there and extend the basis on which we cross people and collect the toll.
Well, I know you have many topics to talk about tonight, but if I've heard how Councilmember Wright laid this out. It's similar to what you've talked about in the past. If I draft a letter to that effect and circulate it tomorrow morning for your review, I'd appreciate it.
Suzanne, may I ask a question from obviously the position that Councilmember Wright has proposed is, I can certainly say, I can write the letter for you since I have so many versions of it sitting on my computer, from task force business
That's right, we've done this
or
many
drafting
times.
things
And I
for the
have a
mayor.
version or two myself.
Right.
I guess one of the questions, Susie, from your discussions with the county staff is, maybe this is a bad parallel, but somewhat the issue with the Piney Branch Pool, where that is a county-owned facility, but where Councilmember Leventhal came to this council and said, you have a better chance of getting funding if the city of Tacoma Park chips in something. Do you have any read whatsoever whether or not the county is more or less likely to be amenable to helping the city financially if we contribute or if we don't contribute?
Yes. The letter by Councilmember Irvin and Councilmember Elrich were very clear that this would be a shared partnership on the repair portion, up to $84,000 each from the county. And that was reiterated in the discussion at the Transportation and Environmental Committee on Monday. I feel pretty comfortable that they would not give us funds if we took that money out. I think they just say, well, you'll see what happens and it'll be your fault. But I have, I think, seen fairly good understanding by the county council members that I've dealt with on this, that they would like to work on this, that they do understand that this is an issue. And I think that they are willing to contribute, recognizing that the task force information is yet to come, so that larger discussion is still to happen.
And if I can just say that I think this is an instance where, it's another instance where we may feel, and from our point of view, rightfully so, that we have a good handle on what the issue is and how it should be dealt with, and the county doesn't share our point of view, but that we have to continue to try and work cooperatively with them. And even though we feel like the proper solution is not to contribute toward something, that we need to continue to do that in the best interests of working to eventually get them convinced of our point of view on bridges, Piney Branch Pool, rebate issues in general, that it's a tough road to take, but that we have to continue to try and work with them, and that they're receptive as we do that. Councilmember Wright.
I mean, I think this is a great example where we can say we're willing to work with you on the Piney Branch Pool, because you can actually make a logical argument that what we're requesting is more recreational or pool services than the area potentially deserves, right? Like, or requires, because they have the Long Branch pool, they have a pool, an outdoor pool over at Long Branch. There's much more of a logical argument that you can say the residents or city is benefiting above and beyond by having this pool. In the case of the bridges, you can't really say that. We're not asking for more bridges, like a special type of bridge or a bridge that's different from the bridges that go over Wayne Avenue and Piney Branch Avenue, which happen to be in Silver Spring, right? It's just not logically. That's why I think this is a good example where we say this is a place where we're not willing to budge, because logically how the concept of the rebate set up, it doesn't fly that way.
Right.
And by doing it, we set a bad precedent that every time it comes to the bridge, it's about a negotiation.
If I may, in case there's any county staff who pull this record, I just want to make it clear, Councilmember Wright, the position I have taken in the task force discussions regarding the Piney Branch Pool is contradictory to yours. My position to the county staff has been that this is a county facility, that it is not geared towards Tacoma Park residents. It is used by students at the school who are from Montgomery County, and it is the county's responsibility to provide an aquatic recreational option in the Down County area. And I want to make that clear, because one of the issues that the county staff has said to me, and I was successful in getting them to back off, was that they have agreed that they should be providing us a rebate for recreational services, but at one point in those discussions, if this council is even suggesting that that is geared towards Tacoma Park, then they will consider that a grant and reduce our rebate for recreational services accordingly. So I just want to share with you the position that I have taken in the task force, that any contribution that the city makes is essentially out of the goodness of our heart, and we should not be penalized for doing that. So I just want to make sure.
I think that's a fair position. I was just saying sort of, and I agree with that position. You logically could make the other argument, which I don't happen to agree with. You can't even logically make that argument with the bridge, is my point.
I do want to say that at the Transportation and Environment Committee, I did say that it is the city's position that the county should be paying for this work, but that nevertheless we recognize public safety issues, And we recognize that the tax duplication discussions have not been completed, and we recognize that the work needs to be done in the coming year. And for that reason, we've made this, the city manager has put this amount in the budget. If there's some other aspects that I need to include, I'd like to know. I understand that.
I would just make sure that the prudent effects of fixing the bridge now before it deteriorates further are front and center. I had one other light thought, which is I'll bring up, and that is, do we have the right to set the speed limit at whatever rate we want on that bridge?
I believe it's under our control. I would assume so.
So if we set it at 1 mile an hour and then set a speed camera up there for 2 miles an hour, would it work?
I would note that I cross that bridge in the morning. There you go.
Set it at 0 and then.
And if I could just make one final point, that if there's a way to include language in the letter that points out to them that we know that one of their fears on dealing with funding for these bridges is that it sets a precedent for what they would have to do for bridges in other municipalities around the county, and that using the opportunity for the stimulus funding is a perfect opportunity not to set a precedent, so do it.
This is clearly an emergency in a special case with special one-time funds that the city doesn't otherwise have access to.
And we'll make the other arguments, we'll continue to make the other arguments, but in the meantime, here's a nice, clean way for them to do this.
Can I just ask a question to the city manager about what is the nature of the discussions in the task force? Like, is there a chance that the findings of the tax duplication is going to find in the favor of municipalities that the bridges should be repaired by the county?
I helped draft, what is likely to be the final task force report. There's just a few tweaks that need to be made. What will end up, I believe, in the final language, and I feel pretty much 100% certain of this, is that the position that this council has talked about will be consistent with the position taken by the municipalities. The county staff has repeatedly, respectfully disagreed with me about that. So I think what will end up in the task force report will basically be conflicting. There's no resolution on this issue from the task force at all.
And as long as you've brought that up, would you care to characterize the status of that report and why the status is what it is?
There are, as far as just the overall report.
The fact that it hasn't been issued yet?
There was a considerable, when we met last summer, the county staff, and I was appreciative of this actually, agreed that they would take the first shot at drafting the report. That took much longer, I think, than we all had hoped. Once the municipalities received the report, I would say we were not satisfied with the county draft. On behalf of the municipalities, I then took the lead in drafting an alternative report. The task force then met. There were some issues from what I drafted that the county staff had some objections with. We've kind of worked through that. We essentially have a fairly solid draft at this point. There are 2 sections that are still in need of amendment. The representative from Gaithersburg wanted to take a shot at drafting some proposed language on one section. I offered to draft some language on another. Truthfully, I think I can speak for myself. With the pressure of our own budget process, I've not had a chance to do that. Hoping to get to that in the next few weeks and circle that back through the task force. Other than those 2 sections, and I don't think they're language issues, not substantive issues, the report will then be finalized and go to the county executive.
And at this point, it's been 2 years in the process?
I've sort of lost track, Mayor Williams. It's been a really long time.
And how much has the rebate increased over that time?
0.
It's been held steady.
It has been held steady, I would say, in some areas based on the current formulas. If the formula had been enforced, it would actually have been to the detriment of the municipality. So there are some areas where there is agreement, such as recreation, where the good news is the county does agree that we are owed something for that. So obviously, the fact we haven't gotten that is a bad thing. On the other hand, if the county had not held us constant at the FY07 level, we would have seen a reduction in other areas, in all likelihood, so.
And that's why we wanted the task force, because we thought the existing formulas were not correct.
Right.
Okay, I just wanted to catch that while we were there.
The last thing that I would just note that was in the packet, and then, like I said, I'd like to hear the council's discussion. The council had asked me to try to put together at least some options that you could consider if you wish to basically reduce general government expenditures. You know, I took, there was obviously very little time. The examples that are here, truthfully, are just designed to give you a flavor, if you will, of things that you could look at. These are not things, just to be clear, that I am recommending. And they are certainly, it's certainly not an all-inclusive list. There's only so much one can do in the time that I had. I would certainly be more than happy to go back and supplement this with some other things for your consideration, but at least I wanted to get something in your hands this evening that you could sort of mull over, you know, either discuss this evening or on Monday night. And like I said, I'd be happy to try to put together some additional options for the council, you know, after hearing your discussion this evening.
And if I can get one clarification on Ms. Brooks' unreserved fund balance memo, in the second paragraph, which is under the what is fund balance heading, I want to make sure that I understand correctly about two-thirds of the way through that paragraph. You say the unreserved portion of the general fund balance included $1.7 million and change that was designated for subsequent years' expenditures. And I want to, what I thought when I read that was, oh, there are projects that are anticipated to happen in 1 year that get carried over into the next year. Is that included in that, or is that?
What that is, when we do the budget, and it's anticipated because the expenditures exceed the revenues, that we're going to use fund balance to cover that difference. Then in the year-end audit report, we set up a designation of the fund balance that we know is going to be used in the next fiscal year.
Okay. And that's different than what I asked about.
Yes.
Where's the section that I asked about? Where does that fall in your explanation?
If projects are carryover?
Yes.
There's two different ways that's typically handled. There are some cities that essentially actually prepare sort of a carryover list from one fiscal year to another. In my opinion, that gets a little unwieldy. What we do, Mayor, is just simply rebudget those projects. Typically, they will show up on the reconciliation list that gets published in the final budget document, and they'll be noted as carryover items. But we essentially just reprogram them and rebudget them in the new year.
So that those carryover projects are not technically part of this fund balance discussion that you're talking about?
That is correct.
They're zeroed out in the previous year and put in new in the
yes.
in the next year?
That's correct.
Okay.
What you're referring to is encumbrances, which are basically obligations, and we don't carry over encumbrances.
Okay. I just want to clarify that, since as I read this piece, my first inclination was to stick those pieces in that section, but obviously not. Okay. I guess I would first like to see if anybody has any additional clarifying questions before we get to kind of what people think and where we want to go. Councilmember Snipper, do you have any clarifying questions?
Well, I do have a process question.
Go ahead.
The process question concerns what you think we're going to do right now. Just give me an idea.
Well, my original idea this morning was to see if we could get some general agreement about areas that we thought we wanted to talk about and come up with some possibilities for how we would change the proposed budget. There were additional items kind of put on the table late in the day, which I know in my own case added a few items to what I thought I might want to consider. So I was thinking first if there was a way of looking at some broad categories of things like, say for instance, how people wanted to deal with existing positions, vacant positions, personnel, that kind of thing, so that we had a sense of, say for instance, people said, we don't, as an example, we don't want to look at RIFs, getting rid of people who are working here, but we have an interest in looking at vacant positions and what we can do with those, and given the city manager's memo on that has already provided one instance where it seems that was a simple solution, looking for discussion on others. And I think there was the general area of the whole question of what is a proper fund balance level and how we should discuss what we wanted to do with fund balance. That involves potentially changing how the Public Works renovation project would get funded. It could change something like the shortfall in the equipment replacement reserve. So that kind of discussion about that and other areas on the fund balance. So I guess I would put those two areas, kind of personnel and fund balance, as places that were joined groups of discussions. Does anybody have other groups? Do people agree that that's a good way to go? And if so, do people have any other areas that they would put forward as kind of areas that we would want to consider? Councilmember Wright.
I'm going to pass this out because not to look at the top part, to look at the bottom part, because I think it's another kind of big area for us to get clarity on and understand. So this is something I put together very quickly. I think it's accurate, but I realize this is the first time the city manager's seeing it. I'll wait till it gets across the way and I sent a copy of this to Ruben right after I left work around 5:30. So the item at the bottom basically shows for FY09, FY08, and FY07 adopted, what the adopted budget was, and then the audited for 08 and 07. It says audited, but technically in FY09 it's the estimate, right, because we don't have the audited numbers yet. And basically what it shows is that every year of those 3 years, the estimated or audited, which is what basically the actual number is of what we spent, has been significantly lower than what we adopted as a budget. And in percentage terms, in this year it looks like it's going to be 8.3%. Last year it was 11%. In 07 it was 6.3%. On average it's 8.8%. That difference is equated to about $5 million. And ultimately that builds our reserve, right? Like at the end of the year that ends up meaning that our general fund reserve is bigger. Given that if you look at our general fund reserve, it's pretty significant, even when you look at the unreserved numbers, it's pretty significant, and even with this budget, it's supposed to be $4.6 million at the end of 2010.
I can make some general comments, if I may, because I think on Monday evening, and I have to confess, Councilmember Wright, Yvonne and I talked a little bit about FY08, truthfully just sort of a snapshot as we were talking about putting together other materials. In part, and certainly not entirely, part of what you see on the expenditure side has to do with the way the city actually budgets. And this is particularly true in the non-departmental budgetary unit. As the council may recall, and Yvonne and I talked that there's a different way of doing this, but for disclosure purposes, we actually show the contribution to the equipment replacement reserve as an expenditure. And in your budget binder, it notes that it's done for transparency purposes, but it's really not an expenditure. So every time you look at the non-departmental in the audit reports, for instance, for this year, you're going to see automatically, I can tell you right now, expenditures in non-departmental coming in $500,000 less than budget because we're budgeting that number, so as it flows through the calculations, it's accounted for in the reduction of the unrestricted fund balance. We've talked about if there's a different way to do that, because we do understand that someone sees this $500,000 gap and thinks, geez, these people don't know what they're doing. The other
I've heard that.
Now, Councilmember Siemens, don't nod at that. Okay, my feelings are hurt. The other thing that the city does from a budgeting perspective that can contribute, and it depends on what happens year to year, is the way that the unappropriated reserve is budgeted. I'm not a lawyer, and Yvonne and I talked about this. When I read the charter, it is very clear that there is a charter requirement that a contingency account of 0.5% of revenues is to actually be budgeted as an expenditure. The city, by practice, has budgeted the 2% unappropriated reserve, and I have truthfully continued that practice during my tenure as the manager. Yvonne and I have talked about getting an opinion from the city attorney's office of whether that budgeting is actually required, because essentially what it means is you set aside 2% of revenues, which is roughly $400,000, I believe, in FY 2010, and unless the council goes on a spending spree, which are usually extremely judicious about that unappropriated reserve, essentially, and it's noted in the transmittal message this way, if that's not expended, that falls back to fund balance. So if you look at those two numbers, which is a budgeting practice, you can, right now, if nothing is expended from the unappropriated reserve, you've got a $900,000 variance in the non-departmental section of the budget for FY 2010. So I'm not saying that explains all the variances that you're looking at, but it's a good chunk of change.
And it's essentially that those two figures and potentially some other ones are built in and recur every year, and they're a piece of whatever those numbers are, and it's the same piece again and again and again,
Right.
and it just keeps moving.
One of the comments that I make every year in the transmittal message is about the unappropriated reserve and noting that for budgeting purposes, it is budgeted, it is assumed to be expended, but if it is not expended, then essentially that ending fund balance number is understated. So, I mean, we can certainly talk to the city attorney's office if there's a different way that we don't have to budget the unappropriated reserve. Quite frankly, I think there's a fiscal management rationale for not budgeting it. I don't think this council has done that, but sometimes when you automatically budget something, an unappropriated reserve or a contingency account, truthfully, from a fiscal constraint standpoint, it starts making it a little bit easy for some elected officials, and once again, I'm not talking about this council, to just think, well, it's expended, it's budgeted, therefore I can expend it. I think it can actually make it easier to make spending decisions that you might not otherwise make if you actually had to go before the public and bump up your overall expenditures. But anyway, I wanted to share that with the council.
But even if you took those numbers, I mean, it's harder to go back in 07, 08 because I don't know those numbers off the top of my head, but even if you take those numbers for like 09 or 08, there's still significant chunks of money where we come in under budget. Now that's conservative budgeting, and it's not necessarily bad. It prevents you from having bad surprises. But I think my point is that there's some inherent efficiency or job that you guys do, and I'm giving you credit for this, around making sure the city is judicious in spending its money and saves extra money every year. And given that our reserve is actually pretty healthy, maybe it makes sense that we trim that a little bit closer now that we have a healthy reserve. And
you're saying trim the reserve? I'm trying to make sure I understand.
No, budget more.
Less conservative.
Less conservatively.
This is the issue that I think I brought up the very kind of first night of the budget process, and as I shared with the council at that time, what we do, which I think mirrors what most jurisdictions do, is we budget assuming full employment. And as I shared with the council that evening, that's certainly, it's a reasonable approach. Is it a conservative approach? Yes. There is one department in the FY 2010 budget where there's different terms for this, minus salary savings, where I have not budgeted at full employment, and that was in Public Works. And that was because as I was putting together my proposed budget, inherently every year, and in part just due to the nature of some of the jobs in Public Works, we have turnover. So the salaries in Public Works are actually $17,000 less than what full employment figures would warrant. I have not done that in other departments, truthfully, other with the exception of the Police Department and Public Works. Many of the other city departments have not historically experienced turnover. And truthfully, in the case of the Police Department, I think certainly the chief, and it's been one of the mandates I gave him once he came on board, I think was to try to keep the department at full employment. So I think, there certainly have been years where we have not been at full employment, and I think that's probably been the case every single year.
And one other clarification on how salaries are budgeted with the ability to overhire by one position in the police department. Are the 42 positions budgeted?
Yes, they are. As I think I may have mentioned to the council, and the chief and I have talked about this, we budgeted at 42, mainly because at this point we don't know that anyone's leaving. What the chief and I have agreed is that if an officer leaves at any point during the fiscal year, we're not going to fill that vacancy, and we will take the department back to 41. As the council may recall, and this goes back some time, at the time we made the decision to actually overhire, we were facing a potential loss due to disability, some other issues of up to 5 officers. Thankfully, that's not been the case for some time, so I think the chief and I are both comfortable taking it back to 41 at the earliest opportunity.
Okay, so my sense is that the council wants to have some further discussion on what I characterized as the whole fund balance area, which Councilmember Wright was talking about with his chart, and which I think also gets over into the if we're going to change the level of fund balance that we think is the right one to have. What would we do with that? And if the city manager can tell me if I'm mischaracterizing the proposed budget, it was to use some of the fund balance as the essentially cash in on the Public Works project, and then some council members have felt that a better way to do that would be to borrow more of or the full amount for that project and do something else with that essentially cash from the fund balance. And my suggestion at that point was that we might want to consider more fully funding the equipment replacement reserve, since according to the city manager's analysis, it requires more than we have put in it for a long time, and we have been consistently underfunding it, and there were years in the past where it got no funding. So I kind of see that whole discussion as the fund balance question. Do my colleagues see it that way, or any other comments we want to make on that, or do we want to consider other areas?
Well, just to make a comment, so there's the, how much should the unrestricted reserve be question, and then there's the sort of unspent budget question, which I think are slightly separate. Even though you kind of put them together, I think they are slightly separate.
Okay. Other comments on that area? Councilmember Siemens?
I'm not sure it's that area.
But you're the only one with a hand up, so if it isn't that area, you can take us in a new area,
Sounded
a
like
general area for discussion, unless Councilmember Wright has something on that area.
I just have, the other option with that money is to give people reduce the tax rate. We don't have to put it towards equipment reserve, right? We could also.
No, that was my suggestion of one area we could go. Councilmember Clay.
I've been listening to the city manager over the last 4 years, and the issue about the operational dollars versus non-operational dollars would seem to indicate that if we were going to take the money from the reserve that we're going to spend on the Public Works Department and move that into a bond, which makes sense to make so that folks who are actually using and benefiting from the Public Works Department are paying for it. They're paying for it over the life of the service. Is that we couldn't really take that money and just reduce the tax rate in general, because then we would set ourselves up for a structural deficit in the future if we used it for operational funds. So it seems like we could only use it to the extent that we could find one-time costs in the current budget that we could move over to use those funds for. And I don't know that we have $500,000 in one-time costs that it would seem reasonable to put against the $500,000. Maybe the city manager could answer that question.
And if I can first just say that I kind of went where you were going and thought I came up with the solution with the equipment replacement reserve, because that was essentially helping to fund the recurring cost of those items rather than a one-time expenditure.
Yes, and I think, you know, it's a trade-off either way down the road. Obviously, if we use the money that we have now, we're not having a bond payment or a bigger bond payment into the future. If we move it over to the equipment reserve, then we can stabilize those one-time costs of equipment, which also helps to stabilize the tax rate in the future. So either way, you kind of win into the future. But if the purpose of the shift now is to have an impact on our current tax rate, the only way that's going to happen is if we identify existing items in the current budget that we can put against that. And so maybe we could identify those items with help from the city manager, put it against that to the extent that reduces the current tax rate, and put the rest of it into the equipment reserve fund to help stabilize the rates into the future. Does that make sense?
I think so.
The other perspective could be that by reducing the tax rate, you're not saying to people that your tax rate is going to be reduced forever, but that the city has funds, and it's not necessary. I'm not saying we necessarily should do this, but there could be a logical argument that says that the government should return those funds to the taxpayers. And given that the economy is particularly bad right now, and ideally will turn around in the coming years, that there does seem to be some validity to saying, in this year, we're keeping the tax rate, the real taxes that people pay, flat or only going up a little bit.
I have a comment to that, but could you first tell us how much is available?
How much is available in terms?
Is there a lot of money
in the reserve?
No, in
one-time
expenses.
projects?
If I can answer a question just with a comment, and I think Councilmember Clay probably accurately characterized, I guess, my financial approach, and I think I can safely say it's that of Ms. Brooks, who probably is even more conservative than I am. Our recommendation, and certainly I think we looked at the level of the fund balance as we were putting together this budget, and I think Councilmember Clay has accurately characterized both of our sentiments in terms of what do you do with dollars. And I think what we tried to do is to look at those things where we were essentially not funding services with revenues that are not going to continue. And I've been consistent in terms of my philosophy about that as well. So then I think you look at how do you use those funds. As the mayor noted, and I think I did some analysis last year and shared that with the council, I mean, I've made a practice ever since I've been here making sure that money went into the equipment replacement reserve. For reasons I can't really speak to, that was not the case in many years prior to my tenure. So even with what's in the proposed budget, I recommended a contribution of $750,000 when the Public Works Director actually ran the calculations. An ideal funding level, quite honestly, is double that. In terms of the Public Works facility, when Yvonne and I were working on this, we felt it was an appropriate and I think a balanced investment of cash in that facility. And certainly, I understand Councilmember Wright's comment that borrowing is cheap right now. But the one thing with borrowing is once it's done, the taxpayers are going to have to pay those debt service payments. That's going to be an ongoing obligation for a number of years. I think there needs to be some balance taking into account the life of the facility, but I'm just not an advocate of taking on debt unnecessarily, because in FY 2011, those debt payments are going to kick into gear, and all of us through the budgeting process are going to have to figure out how to pay for them. So if there is one-time money, and we can essentially not incur debt that we don't have to incur, then that would be my recommendation to the council. In saying all this, and I just want to make it clear, I'm not at all saying that we should not be looking at ways to relieve the tax burden on residents. What I'm saying is I hesitate to say that we take ongoing operations and fund them with one-time money, because I think I've seen many cities do that, and you set yourself up for a fall, and potentially a big one. But ultimately, that's a decision of this council of how you want to do that. There may be other one-time type of projects that the council has in mind. I don't know what those might be. The equipment replacement reserve contribution, and I think the public works facility were certainly things that Yvonne and I talked about as we were putting together the proposed budget. The other idea, and I believe it was Councilmember Wright, I think who originally stated this, is we have an equipment replacement reserve. What we are lacking at this time in the city is some type of facility reserve, and I would imagine at some point, I'm sure Ellen Arnold Robbins hopes sometime in the very near future we might actually be looking to do some improvements to the library. I think that might be an appropriate thing for the council to consider, is should we establish a reserve for city facilities.
So could I just take a second and ask something about how you just characterize things and see if you have a ready answer. I think it would be fair to say that you, in putting together your proposed budget, balanced how you thought the fund balance should be used in the proposed FY10 budget, and what level of funding was optimal given all the other considerations for the equipment replacement reserve at $750,000. If the it's kind of, if the council decides that the fund balance can be tweaked, does that, would you say that your sense of the $750,000 for the equipment replacement reserve changes, is the place where that it would change if we're talking about fund balance changes, or is it still, would you still say that the $750,000 for the reserve would be a reasonable level, and the fund balance question should go to other possibilities? Because I know they're related.
They are related. I mean, I think as I stated when I actually presented the budget earlier this month, you know, in a perfect world, I think it would be great to contribute more to the equipment replacement reserve. Yeah, but I think that needs to be balanced against other city priorities, and that, you know, that could be trying to lower the tax burden on residents. I think that could also be, you know, other things that the council may want to do with money, and those are things for you all to define. You know, I don't necessarily go into this budget process assuming that there are not things that I did not include that the council would not want to add, and I think, yeah, that's coming true. Could we try, particularly, to leave at least some flexibility for the council to maneuver as you decide what other priorities you might have had that I didn't take into account?
Do we still have kind of fund balance related issues, or we're eventually Councilmember Siemens will get to charge into another hill?
I have all night, thank you.
Councilmember Wright.
The reason I put together this chart is because the conversation or the point about ongoing revenue versus one-time revenue, this chart sort of shows that it doesn't totally hold water, or that we're not consistent in our thinking about it. Because what this chart shows is that we've been, for whatever reason, it's happened, not intentionally. or maybe intentionally, we budget conservatively, and then you have ongoing revenues, which are supposed to be going to ongoing services, are greater than the cost of the services. And, the fund balance increases. And then we're told that fund balance can only be used to fund one-time expenditures, when it really is the result of
Build up over time.
build up over time of ongoing expenditures. And that's why I think that it is actually valid to be able to say, we can use either some of the fund balance or be more conservative in the budgeting to give people a reduced tax rate in this year, and be very explicit about, we're doing it because we were, we basically over budgeted a little bit the last couple of years, and we realize economic times are tough, and this is enabling us to hold the tax rate at a certain level, or the actual tax you pay at a certain level, or a little bit more, but that may not be the case next year. And since we can't, at the end of the year, do what the federal government does, which is, we've taxed you more than what we needed, so we're going to write the 17,000 or 18,000 people in Homework a check. We're not going to do that. So this is the alternative way of doing it.
Well, maybe, and I don't know if this would be helpful to the council, I had actually run some reports. I like to think I sometimes know where you're coming from, so I had run some reports. Unfortunately, with putting together the rest of the materials, I didn't get the chance to thoroughly review them. If it would be helpful to the council, I have printed out reports for FY07, FY08, and FY09, and could just do sort of a quick analysis in terms of where those variances occurred and why. I would say part of why the fund balance has, on the revenue side of things, and Yvonne and I had talked about this, I would say particularly going back several years ago, income taxes have been notoriously hard to predict, as we have discussed, and there were several years, probably going back in the last 10 years, where the city got considerably more in income tax revenues than it had projected, which is part of the reason why we've been trying to refine that. So it's a combination of several things, certainly expenditures coming in less, and in some cases revenues coming in higher. So if that analysis would be helpful, I'd be happy to do it. If it's not something the council's interested in, then that's fine.
I think it would be helpful, because my sense is that we want to feel that we understand this area well enough that we want to try and make an adjustment, but we want to feel confident that we're making the right adjustment.
Yeah, if I could, and at the risk of getting this discussion more off point, and that's not my intent, but one of the things that might be helpful or beneficial to me, at least during the budget discussion, is to get a better understanding when you talk about tax relief of who the council has in mind. And there's this very specific reason I ask that, is when you cut the tax rate generally, that certainly benefits homeowners. It benefits those who own commercial properties. And, there's a number of components to property taxes. So it's residential properties, it's commercial properties, it's the personal property tax. And so that's one approach, which is kind of a broad base. We want to give tax relief to everybody. There is the approach the council has taken through the local supplement to the tax credit program, and I had hoped to be able to confirm this before the meeting, and I apologize I wasn't able to do that, but I have reason to believe that there may have been a change in state law regarding the local supplement, which was previously capped at 50%, that may no longer be capped. I sent an email to the city attorney's office. That type of tax relief is very targeted, as we talked about earlier this evening, to those of certain income restrictions and things like that. There is a potential third option that we have never talked about before, which is something the city of Rockville does, and it's allowed under state law. It's actually referred to as an income tax credit, but the way it actually plays out is it is a credit on the property tax bill. It is capped by the way it is structured by state law, but that is a very targeted type of tax relief that goes to the owners of single-family properties.
Is it just owner-occupied properties?
I believe it's owner-occupied.
It is in Rockville.
And I can get some information to the council. And like I say, I'm not trying to take you in a different direction, but I guess what I want to say is there are different ways of providing tax relief depending on who your target audience is, if you will. And so if that's something you want to discuss, I'd be happy to try to facilitate. those options for you.
Councilmember Siemens has a question on this.
Thank you. No, I appreciate you taking us in a different direction because it gets me in the game.
I'm glad I energized you, Councilmember.
Never mind. Councilmember.
The bottom line here is that we're looking at a 9.8% increase in our budget this year. And this is a year that many of our residents in Tacoma Park are finding to be a difficult year financially. And as we look at the economy and we hear the new indicators that come out, there are some encouraging changes that we see, but there are also some indicators that are discouraging. And so I don't think we can anticipate with any degree of certainty that we're looking at a solid year and that we're going to be in good position economically across the nation next year when we're facing the budget. So I think the prudent thing for this council to do is to be very conservative with the budget. I think that we as a council should, as part of our discussion, set a target. I think it's unfortunately late in the game to be doing that. It would probably help the city manager if we had set a target earlier in the process, but I think I would certainly like to see something far below a 9.8% increase, and I think it would be helpful if we could discuss that amount.
And if I can just get a clarification on the 9.8%, whether that's for the whole budget or the general fund, or which I want to make sure that that number is accurately described.
I believe that's an overall 9.8%. It was in the cover sheet of the constant yield tax rate presentation.
So that it's the 9.8% is the
It's the increase in property
tax.
value. It's the increase in property values, isn't it, Yvonne? My recollection is that's the increase in assessed value.
Right.
For 2010.
So it's the revenue from the assessed value.
No, it's actually the increase in property values, correct?
In the
I believe
assessment.
Mr. Snipper's correct.
Okay.
I just want to make sure that if we're tossing out 9.8%, that we're labeling it accurately.
That's the increase in the revenues that we're expecting this year.
Revenue based on.
Revenue from property
tax.
Between the constant yield and what our tax rate is.
So if we were to keep the same tax rate as the current fiscal year, our revenues from property taxes would increase by 9.8%.
May I? This is from, I wanted to refer back to the transmittal message because that's, the city's assessable real property-based net is estimated to increase by approximately $163.4 million or 9.8% from the prior year.
All right.
Okay, so that's
Let me back up and rephrase this because we've gone down a hole that we didn't need to go. Our budget this year is a whole lot more than it was last year.
That's fair.
That's a fair statement.
All right? And I think it shouldn't be a whole lot more, and we should minimize the increase to the extent that's reasonable without folding down our government and without causing great hardship on our employees. I know that in my personal budgeting, when things are difficult, I can look at dipping into my savings. We talked about that with the reserves here. I can think about going out and borrowing money, which seems like creating additional agony downstream. It's kind of not only postponing the initial problem, but oftentimes creates more problems the following year. Or I can reduce my expenses. And I think that's where we should really be focusing our energy on this council in the next week. I really appreciate the papers that city manager has given us tonight. I think that many of the items that you have listed here I could support eliminating from the budget or postponing till future years when the economy is in better shape. So in addition to, and now I'm bringing this back on topic, in addition to those things that you've mentioned, I think the council should be looking at items within the budget that are either lower priority or things that we just say we can't afford to do at this time right now and we'll postpone those. And one of those, I think, is the borrowing that we're anticipating for the Public Works renovation. And I think it's something that we really need to do. I think it's something that the employees up there have had a very poor facility to work with for a long time. But balancing that against the current economy and the budget we're facing, I think it is foolhardy to borrow money this year. And maybe the interest rate is at rock bottom right now, but it's not going to be skyrocketing in 1 year.
Councilmember Wright, did you have your hand up?
Councilman Christine made me think of a bunch of other things, but I can't remember what we were talking
Good.
about before that. But,
So I shouldn't have let him talk.
no, I think he was had waited his turn very
Yeah, I know.
patiently. I guess I think that we do have to be very judicious, but I also think what we should be focused on is the tax rate that people are paying, not necessarily reducing overall expenditures, because there may be some expenditures that we have grants for, or so just to say that the overall city budget went up and we should make the overall city budget lower doesn't totally hold water with me. I think we need to use Obama's language, use a scalpel, right? Be careful about where we cut or how we think about financing our projects. And I guess I have a very different perspective on debt that the city might take on than Councilmember Siemens, in that I think it is very, very unwise to borrow money, just like you would personally, to fund your ongoing expenditures. Like, so you shouldn't borrow money to buy food as an individual, and we shouldn't borrow money, for example, to pay police officers. But it makes a great deal of sense to borrow money for what are considered capital projects, just like it makes a great deal of sense to borrow money to buy a house, because you're buying an asset, and that asset depreciates over time, and people get the use of that asset over time. And the fact that the money is rock bottom now, yes, it's not going to skyrocket next year, but a 1% increase over the life of on the interest rate over the life of a 10-year bond is not insignificant. And also, when the economy's down, usually you get better prices on the projects. So if you have if you're in a good financial position overall, as the city is, it actually makes quite a bit of sense to invest in capital projects when the economy's down, particularly if you can do that in a way that's not saddling people with a big immediate tax burden. And if you think that generally your economy, your area economy is strong and will come back when the general national economy comes back. So while I definitely agree with Terry that we should be realize that people are suffering and try and reduce the tax burden, I'm not so sure it should be done through things that aren't actually going to reduce the tax burden in terms of cutting the budget. And the last thing, just that I was remembering, is that I don't think anyone is actually, we've talked about tax relief, but I don't think anyone is actually talking about cutting the amount of taxes people are paying. No one's talking about going, at least I haven't heard it, and I'm not proposing that we would go to reducing the real tax rate that the city is getting over, or the real tax income. We may be talking about reducing the rate and getting down to what would be considered flat tax income, but I don't think anyone's talking about going below that. And even, I think, flat would be a big stretch for people.
If I may just respond to Councilmember Wright, I think he makes some good points, and I certainly wasn't suggesting that we would be cutting expenses just across the board, and that's why I didn't reference the work that's to be done on the auditorium that's entirely being paid by grants. But I do feel that your example with borrowing money is valid, but I would be real hesitant if I were in difficult economic times. I would be real hesitant to go out to borrow money to put an addition on my house when I'm unsure what my income's going to be in the coming years.
If I can just make a general point and then try and take us towards some specific actions and process to try and maybe winnow down the areas for additional discussion. Just a quick observation or two on kind of assessment values and tax rates. I don't remember exactly which years it was, but there were some years in the, I would say, mid to late 90s, probably more mid-90s, where the city's assessable base went down, I want to say, about 3 years in a row. It was essentially flat or falling, and that was a very different budgeting time because the only way left to even deal with increasing expenses from, for whatever was going up was to raise the tax rate. For a number of years now, we've been kind of slowly reducing the tax rate because of the assessed values going up and a lot of the 10% cap kicking in.
I don't think we reduced the tax rate at any time, did we?
Many years, yeah.
It was at 66.
Yeah,
now
it
it's
was.
60.
Yeah.
So it's gone down.
It's been going down in increments over a number of years. And what I think I have a handle on, but I can't be sure, is what we're going to be facing a year from now when we've got the reassessment of properties in the city and new assessed values. I can take the example of my own situation where I've tracked what the full assessed value is and what the taxable assessed value is with the 10% cap. I know that the last time I looked at the chart that I made for myself, I looked at what it would take to get my capped value to the full assessed value for what is the current assessment, and observing that it was going to take me until fiscal year 2016 for my slowly increasing under the cap value to reach full assessed value. And thinking, well, what's going to happen with the next assessed value if it goes up? Well, I think everybody would agree that the one that we're going to get in a year is going to go down. And I'm not sure what it's going to go down, but I could see the potential for, in the example that I use of my own situation, where it's possible for the capped value and the full assessed value to get much closer together, if not the same. If there's, say, a 20% drop in assessed value, I don't know what that value is going to be, but all of a sudden, I think we're going to reach a point next year where all of the people who have lived here for a long time, who have been getting the slow increases in assessed value for tax purposes because of that 10% cap, they're going to all of a sudden be on pretty much equal footing with people who have been here for a relatively short period of time and have been paying kind of the full assessed value. So I think we're going to find that next year we have a very different situation to deal with, and that's by way of saying that my sense is that whatever we do with the tax rate this year, and I would like to drop it some, I don't want to drop it too much because I think next year we'll find that we're going to kind of potentially have to bounce back up, just as we've seen in other jurisdictions, like in Virginia, where they don't have the 10% cap, and the tax rates have swung wildly from year to year as the assessed values have swung. They were in some Virginia jurisdictions, their tax rates went up by approaching 25 cents this year, and what people are paying still went down, but the tax rate went up. And I think as you bounce around with that tax rate, it gets very confusing and very difficult for people to understand. And so I look at the fund balance in a way as kind of something that helps even that out a little bit, and all of that by way of saying that I do want to reduce the tax rate, and I think we have some ways to do that, but I don't want to go too far in reaction to a situation that I think is going to change for us next year. And if I can try and get us to where we can deal with a couple things and maybe make some decisions on some reconciliation areas so that we know what we're dealing with next time, I think that would be helpful. But first I see Councilmember Wright and Councilmember Robinson wanting to make comments, so Councilmember and then Councilmember Clay.
I just think the one thing we should keep in mind is, yes, the rate might go up and down, but I think people pay a lot more attention to what they're actually paying, right? So, yes, they look at the assessment, they look at the rate, but really they're wondering, hey, is my tax bill $5,000 this year or $7,000 this year? So, would be more concerned if we ended up seesawing the actual taxes that people are paying as opposed to the rate going up and down a little bit to keep things of that in terms of actual revenue coming in.
I know what you're saying, and I would like to agree that that's the case, but when I hear so many people talk about, oh, the city of Tacoma Park's taxes are, double any other municipality in the state or in the county or whatever, they're always concentrating on rate, and they forget to tie rate to assessed value gets you where you really need to go. So I agree that that's correct, but I'm not sure, I'm not as convinced that people always have that understanding.
Yeah.
Councilmember Robinson.
I think I disagree with you on that last point, Mayor Williams, that people look at the numbers, the dollars that they pay in Tacoma Park as opposed to the dollars that they pay in unincorporated Montgomery County, and they see that it's significantly higher. And the tax rate is certainly a number that they can refer to, but they also look at the dollars. And we all know that that's partly a measure of the duplication payment and the lack of appropriate reimbursement and so forth. I agree that the future, we can't predict the future. My observation, for what it's worth, of kind of American society is we've been producing less than we've been consuming for some decades, and the chickens are kind of coming home to roost, as they say. So, of course, we all hope that the economy will turn around and pull us all out, but I don't think we have any guarantees on that. And, of course, we all hope that our proximity to the federal government center will keep us healthy. Many of our residents work downtown, so that's a stable, one hopes, a stable source of income for them, and then therefore that our property values will stay high. At the same time, I think it's a good opportunity in a way for us to tighten our belts and get ready for the storms ahead. And I really respect our staff, and I think they're doing a great job. And as Councilmember Wright observed at the beginning of this conversation, I don't want people to think that we don't respect them, because I think we all do very much. And I know that we have spent a lot of energy trying to get our salaries in line with the market, and we did a study to try to ensure that our salaries are competitive with other jurisdictions, other municipalities. I was trying to remember what the cost of our getting those salaries in line with other jurisdictions was, and City Manager Matthews just reminded me that initially it would have been a couple $100,000 this year, but as we're waiting, that cost goes down because we're not implementing those adjustments. I haven't heard much discussion of us kind of feathering in those adjustments so that we have a goal of really getting to appropriate market parity, but that we maybe not do it all right away, right now. So that's something I'd like to consider, that we move toward that. But if it's going to be a couple $100,000, that's maybe one area we can ask our staff to work with us to get somewhere where we want to get, but not in an abrupt way. I did the numbers on the general fund summary from adopted FY09 to proposed FY10, and our revenues go up 5.86%, and our expenditures go up 8.56%, and that leaves a shortfall of about $1.2 million. And just to remind us all, what we're talking about is to take that out of the fund balance. I think I have that right. And in addition to the $1.5 million of a bond for the.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
This 1.2 million.
Sounds right.
From the beginning of the year to the end of the year is part of where we would make up the shortfall.
Correct, because there's the allocation to the equipment replacement reserve, and there's the funding for the public works facility.
Right, the 750 and the 500, right?
Actually, the public works facility, the part that is cash, is actually the design as well as part of the construction. Yvonne may have to help me out here, but I think it was about $757,000 in cash towards the public works facility. Does that sound right to you?
Yes.
Yeah.
So those are kind of general comments, but I wanted to make sure I weighed in on kind of respect for our staff. I think they do a great job. At the same time, I think it is a time when we have to tighten our belts all around and think of ways to do more with less.
Councilmember Clay.
I think one of the reasons why people fixate on the tax rate is because when assessments were going up, and every year the tax rate would go down, that's what we publicized in the newspaper, was that
Right.
we lowered the tax rate, even though people's real taxes were going up. And so we just point the finger back at ourselves for that. I think I agree that people focus on the tax rate, but it's because that's what we've taught them to do. And I think that if we do a different kind of messaging about what's really happening around real taxes, that would be better. And I think also, you know, that you message that you're lowering the tax rate now. People will still be paying, for the most part, more. Well, they still be paying more than they paid last year because we don't have much room to lower the tax rate that much. But and to understand that next year, if assessments go down overall, that the rate would go back up, even though the revenues wouldn't go back up by that same amount. And I think that people understand that. Can we reduce the homeowner tax rate without reducing the other tax rates, or do you have to reduce them all at the same time?
The council has discretion. I believe, and Yvonne, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, I think typically the railroad and public utilities rate and the personal property rate is 2.5 times the real property rate. I don't believe that is mandated by law, because I'm somehow recalling that there was a jurisdiction that did not do that. We can verify that. I think part of the reason why Rockville has basically been using this income tax offset, which is essentially a property tax credit, is because it has allowed them to target it specifically to single-family homeowners and not provide any rate reduction for the other classes of property.
Well, I think that's what I would be interested in, is a single-family homeowner targeted tax rate. The other thing I wanted to say is that, you know, I see the different folks that we could, they're not actual people, but positions that we could eliminate. And, you know, I am interested in that, and I just want to put out there that the library and the communications department are tiny relative to the other departments. You know, communication has 4.3 FTEs and library has 9.5 FTEs. So I personally am not really interested in talking about the library or the communications department. I am interested in talking about the recreation department because they have 20.7 FTEs and 8 or 9 people in management coordination positions, which to me is just a really high ratio. And thanks for putting together all the descriptions of all the positions that are open and what they could do. You know, another thing that we could consider to help reduce some cost is to delay hires. You know, where you lapse the time for 3 months or something. If a position comes open, you don't fill it for 3 months. It just kind of helps reduce costs. You could try that approach. The other things like the newsletter, not really that interested in that piece. I don't think that there's a great advantage to not funding the accreditation manager for the police department after we just spent all this energy getting that all back in together. But you know, I'd be open to listening to what other council members have to say about it.
I agree.
And I see leaf vacuum on here. Given that my whole first 6 months in office was about leaf vacuuming, I don't support making any changes to the leaf vacuum.
Maybe it would have been easier on you if we got rid of it.
I think that my life just would have been that much more terrible.
I agree with Councilmember Clay that there are some things in there I don't support, and I look forward to our discussion in detail.
Okay.
I think one area, this is Ruben, one area that hasn't mentioned but the city manager has mentioned that we need to discuss is perhaps scaling back the health benefits some.
There was some discussion of that earlier that you may have missed.
I may have missed it, but I think that should be in the mix. And then there's a small number of items that have come up. Some of them are listed on the sheet that Councilmember Knight handed out, and some of them were just made orally of some additions as well. And so we'll want to talk about some of those too. But the bigger ones, I think we've already laid out.
Okay. If I can take the liberty of trying to get us to come to some conclusion on one or two things, and then get it to be a little bit more focused discussion for Monday night. My sense, I may be wrong, is that the classification and compensation plan implementation that is contemplated for this fiscal year is something that most but not all of the council is willing to go forward with. Am I right with that? And we can kind of say, okay, we've taken care of that one in straw vote manner.
I feel it's still on the table.
I was aware of that, but I'm not sure of anybody else who was going there.
Well, I made the point that maybe it's not all
Feathering,
at one time.
right.
We work toward it.
Anybody else for feathering?
To me, it's not, it's kind of connected to the health care issue because it's all part of the negotiation in some ways with the union, right? Like the compensation study will mean in aggregate that union employees' compensation will go up, not equally. But so to me, that should be part of the discussion with the union. Like, if we're going to do that, then it seems like they should be more open to renegotiating health care.
That was the comment and the discussion that Suzanne and I had with ASME today. I mean, I think certainly not moving forward with implementing that study has consequences for the city, which is, I mean, and we've experienced that with employees leaving for other jurisdictions, picking up 15 to 20 grand. So I do think there's a business reason for the city to move forward. Certainly, there's no doubt it is a benefit to many employees. As the council may recall, we sort of took a lower cost option in terms of how to implement that, like the city of Greenbelt, which is going through this whole process as well. We were not giving every single employee something. We were targeting it to those who were below the market midpoint.
In that way, Councilmember Robinson, we did kind of structure it in as a phased in. We didn't do we're not bringing somebody necessarily up to where they would have been in a new system.
Yeah, I think we tried to basically deal with those below market. There are organizations who are more willing to spend more money and actually make adjustments to those who are above market, just as a matter of course. And certainly I think this came up with our discussion with the union, but I think to comment on Councilmember Wright's comment, what I basically said to ASME, and I think Suzanne has probably conveyed the same thing to Local 400, which is that if we're asking this council and this community to make an investment to adjust these pay disparities, and with the market adjustment, which is a provision in the bargaining agreement that the city has already committed itself to, then certainly it's at least an expectation on my part as the manager that we would hope that the unions would be working with us on the health insurance issue, because I think the alternative, quite frankly, could be things such as furloughs of all city employees and things of that nature. I mean, at some point, it has to be brought in line with what the city's available resources are.
I think that the market adjustments are certainly a component of the whole issue of our increasing staff costs, and I think that it's an unfortunate time to be talking about market rate adjustments when other municipalities are freezing the COLAs and freezing their merit increases and furloughing employees to save money, and in some cases, not in the municipalities, but in the counties, other jurisdictions, actually laying people off. So I think it should still be on the table as we struggle with this. How do we get our tax rate down?
If I could just make a comment, I appreciate hearing all of this. One of the things that I have been, that I feel good about as a manager here in Tacoma Park, is that we have not taken those years when we had some extra funds and just expanded the workforce, as some other jurisdictions have, that now really are facing the crunches. Montgomery County in particular expanded its workforce by a tremendous amount, and we have been very stable in the number of employees that we've kept here. We've looked really carefully every year at the positions and at restructuring and that kind of thing. So in one sense, we've been towing the line pretty good, and I think that has helped us here. Obviously, we're facing a difficult time this year, and we're needing to look at this very closely. But I also don't want to I do want to say that we have, because I think of good management, we have not put ourselves in the awkward position of some of the other jurisdictions in the area, and I'm relieved of that. Relieved about that.
If I can, so I think we have the group generally in favor of making the assumption that for the FY10 budget, we should assume that the classification and compensation adjustment will have taken effect in '09.
Can we have a straw vote on it?
Sure. All those who agree with my assessment just now, please raise a hand.
I'm raising my hand.
Okay. And all those who disagree with that assessment?
I'm now raising mine.
I'm raising mine as a feather.
Okay. So it's 4-2 among those present, and I think with a great degree of confidence, say that Councilmember Barry would be a fifth. So I think we'll make that assumption at this point. I think it might be helpful to see if anybody wants to propose that any of the vacant staff positions as outlined in the city manager's memo, in addition to the school crossing guard, which sounds like we have agreement on kind of almost before it got to us, if anybody wants to propose any of those for possible discussion. I'm not necessarily saying that we decide that tonight, but I think it would be helpful in understanding whether there's interest in pursuing any of those.
Yeah, I have to be honest that I haven't had a chance to read these yet. I see the titles, but I haven't had a chance to read the detail that the city manager provided. I agree with Councilmember Clay that there are some in here that stand out that I could support, and some that stand out that I could not support. In particular, I think the accreditation manager should stay in. I think I don't know. there's other ones too.
Anybody else?
I would
have-
just like some time before we.
Okay. Anybody
make
have
those
any
decisions.
additional comments in that area?
I do.
Yes, Councilmember Klein.
I really think that the management of the recreation department is top-heavy. And I think that while there are 3 openings right now, we should take the opportunity to reduce that, with an understanding that it'll mean that they'll have some more part-time people. You know, if I say exactly what I do, I'd be accused of micromanaging, so maybe the best thing is to do that.
And if I get clarification that one of
One's
the
already been-
vacancies is already
Yeah,
One of
one's
the,
already,
one of the vacant
Sports
recreation coordinator position has already been eliminated in the proposed budget with the expectation that part-time staff would be utilized. That's correct.
so, yeah, so Terry says I should bite the bullet, so here's what I'd do. I'd take one of the 2 senior managers that are just below the director and move them over to the New Hampshire Avenue Recreation Center. I think that having a senior level person over there like that would probably help that institution quite a bit and get it a lot of attention that it doesn't get right now.
Did you say both or just one?
Just one of them. You know, the thing about the position for the other recreation coordinator that's doing the evening desk work out front, I guess I don't have really strong feelings about that. We assembled that before. I wasn't all that crazy about it before because I think you could do a lot of that work with strong part-time people as they were doing before. I'll tell you, the thing that I don't support is there's a suggestion in here of you know, approaching this by reducing hours, and I don't think that is the way to go. So I guess the recreation specialist is the one that I would absolutely not fund again, and if they don't need the sports coordinator, that's fine. But I think we should discuss the facilities managers. I think what that person is actually supposed to be doing.
And I just want to be sure that we're clear again on it's the 2 recreation coordinator positions that are vacant. One is already assumed gone, so that what's on here on the sheet is the 1 recreation coordinator and 1 recreation specialist.
That's correct.
On which sheet is that?
That's the April 30th
The
vacant
list
staff
of
positions
vacant
memo.
positions.
On this sheet. Oh, right.
So it's technically 3 vacancies, but we're only, at the moment, in the proposed budget, funding 2.
That's correct.
I thought that Councilmember Clay's comments about the amount that would be saved in each department, based on both the vacancies and the other recommendations, as a percentage of the entire department's budget, was cogent and potent, perhaps. And I'd like to have a little bit of time to evaluate this in that light. In other words, eliminating a person in a large department is different from eliminating a person in a small department. And also, there's the notion of what the budget proposal for this year is from department to department. I note that some departments are advocating a much larger, are advocating a large increase or an increase, and other departments are advocating actually a decrease in their budget. So rather than weigh in, I'm feeling the need to do a little bit of analysis on my own.
I empathize with you.
And I guess my reaction is I'm not sure that what I would think is that in general the departments are going up by similar amounts because it tends to be things like the market adjustment of salaries therefore, I'm not sure that there are departments that are going down. It may be other factors that are in there that are causing that variance. I see the city manager shaking her head.
That's correct. I mean, what I would encourage the council to do is to go back and look at the department summaries, because we, you know, I think you'll look at the broad-based categories. Probably one of the departments that, off the top of my head, I can think of that may have gone down, I'm drawing a blank right now, would be housing and community development, maybe a department where you tend to have a lot of contractual expenses. They go down just because of the nature of the work that is occurring from one fiscal year to another, rather than some fundamental change in their core day-to-day service. And many of the departments, I think as the mayor indicated, there's going to be personnel-related expenses that are not being determined really by that department head. I mean, certainly, you know, in the case of recreation, you know, Ms. Hadovan basically came to me basically with a proposal to eliminate a full-time job and utilize part-time staff as a cost-saving measure. So that was something she brought forward on her own. Chief and I have obviously talked about the crossing guard position. So.
And if I can just get a little clarification on the org charts that we got, the recreation department shows FTEs of 20.07, but the full-time employees is what, about 8?
Give me a minute to count, Mayor. I'd be happy to answer your question.
They're split up in so many ways.
Yeah,
people are wearing a lot of hats on that one.
I think that's about right.
So one of the points also with
the director, the 2 assistants, the program coordinator, there's the aftercare person, the teen coordinator, the senior coordinator, and then there's Melanie's position and the position for who was ever over at the New Hampshire Avenue Rec Center.
9.
The senior person's only 3/4 time, but that's 9 full-time that I can count off the top of my head.
Okay.
One of the issues, certainly with recreation, that isn't quite represented here is that even though it might say, you know, part-time staff of, you know, 2.64, that can really vary because you may have multiple people for different seasons of the, you know, different programs. So one of the responsibilities of the managers is to oversee quite a few different people over the course of a year. So even though it's represented as a certain number of FTEs, it could be a lot of bodies over the course of the year for the non-regular staff.
I would echo that, and I guess what I would encourage the council generally to look at is, and this certainly was part of the compensation and classification study, which Joe Plywin did fairly detailed work in terms of what were the functions that people were overseeing or the staff that they were supervising, and that certainly played into those benchmarks and what was, you know, how those comparisons were arrived at. I would just note, since it's come up, certainly I'm not trying to get a discussion turning on another department, but if you look at the library, which has been noted as having a relatively small staff, if we're just looking at titles, and we have a director and we have 3 individuals who have the title library manager, so you could look at that from a percentage standpoint and say half the library has supervisory titles and is top-heavy, and I'm not saying at all that's the case. I'm just saying I think the same analysis could be applied to the library that is being applied to the recreation department.
Well, certain departments lend themselves to having professionals, like the Housing and Community Development Department is a good example where, you know, all of your staff, almost all of your staff, maybe you have an assistant too, that are professionally credentialed. You know, you have to have people that have pretty good training, but you just don't have to have a recreation department that's staffed with that many. You don't have to have that many professionals in that area. I mean, I said before that my philosophy is it should be a place where it's a place for people to get jobs coming up and through. And I've worked in a couple of different recreation departments. I've never worked in a department that has so many managers for the number of line staff that they have, especially at the senior management level. I mean, we have as many senior managers as I think the entire city of Oakland program had altogether for 236,000 people.
Councilmember Wright.
I agree with Councilmember Clay's concerns about the amount of senior management that exists in the recreation issue that I would bring up is...
Could you speak up?
Sure, sorry, I wasn't talking to the microphone. One of the issue I would bring up goes back to the bottom of that page or that chart I filled out. Most of these things we're talking about are maybe $50,000 at best. If you look at that chart, you're talking about 1.7, 2.3, and $1.1 million in each of the last 3 years that we over budgeted. Now, I hear the city manager's points about where some of that could come, but just based on rough calculations, it doesn't seem like it's likely more than half in any of those years. So somewhere, there's a place to find additional savings. And since I've asked for in the past much more detailed information about the budget, but been told we don't want to get too much into the weeds, I'm willing to accept that I won't go into the weeds. But instead, I will just say, which is something that I disagreed with Councilmember Robinson on last year, but now, given that I don't have the information to try and actually pick out the things, I have no choice but to agree, which is to say, I think you can find 2 to 3% in there, which equates to, 450 to 980,000. Sorry, no,
693.
Yeah, 462 to 693, which dwarfs all these other numbers. I don't know where you're going to find it, but it existed in all the last previous years. I don't know if that means we over budgeted on pencils. I've been told not to care, so I'm not going to care about the specifics, but I am going to care deeply about the high-level number and say that I think that's where those efficiency savings come from. And in all those years, we didn't lay off anybody, we didn't cut a program, and we didn't actually cut earmarked money to the council, what I would consider earmarked money, specific projects that we wanted to fund. So I guess it's sharpen those pencils that I don't know about, and
You're not supposed to know
paper
paper
clips,
clips.
whatever it is. Like,
As I've indicated, I'm happy to provide the analysis, and I will have that available for you. I think what would be very helpful to me at this point is, and I think it was Councilmember Siemens' idea, if this council could please give me a target of where you want to head, we will bring back options to meet that. But it is challenging as a staff, listening to 7 different people with all different ideas.
Good ideas.
To try to do wonderful ideas, but to try to provide the level of staff support that I feel we should be doing in this budget process. And I think everyone sitting on this dais hopefully knows how seriously I take my responsibility for this budget. I can't help you get to where you want if I'm not getting a sense from a majority of the council of what that is. So if someone could please do that, that would give us, Yvonne Brooks and I, the opportunity. I mean, basically, I have less than 24 hours before the agenda packet goes out for Monday night. And I don't like springing information on you at the last minute, but that means I need direction this evening from a majority of this council.
Councilmember Wright.
maybe we should take a straw, I think if we take a straw vote on these items here and anything else, then, and a straw vote on what penny per 100 the tax rate we want to go down, then you have that number, basically. Right?
May I make a request? And I'm not sure which list you're looking at. As I mentioned at the start, in the limited time that I had between Monday night at midnight and now, I did my best shot at trying to pull some items together. I don't know necessarily that those are the items that if I had a better understanding of the council's target and its directions, that these would be what I would suggest.
And there's other items that, you know, have been on lists that may be more appropriate depending on
Given
what
your
the-
goals, I guess if you could just give me a target and perhaps give me I mean, one of the things I would say generally, you know, everything is sort of is a trade-off, and I mean, I think that's true. As I indicated on one of the things, and I'm not saying this is what I'm suggesting, there's the issue if the council, and I'm not saying this is necessarily the necessary or it's a requirement, but if the council feels that you would be willing to reduce the city's budget perhaps by putting less emphasis on New Hampshire Avenue, and I'm not saying that the council feels that way, and I'm not suggesting that that will become necessary. But if I had an indication from the council that that's okay with you, that trade-off is all right, and you would fall down on the side of, you know, reducing expenditures, that's perfectly appropriate. That's your prerogative as a council. But as I'm trying to come up with, you know, options for you all, in some cases, there's a trade-off between what are the goals in your strategic plan and the council's, very expressed desire to reduce taxes. So I guess if there's a tax rate target that you have in mind, and that's the premier goal, and that may mean some of your strategic planning goals don't progress as quickly as you would like, that's perfectly fine.
I don't want to interrupt, so I'm going to anyway.
Yeah.
I think most of the discussion this evening, and it's been quite lengthy, has focused not on specific things like, for example, New Hampshire Avenue or not, but in reducing the cushion, which seems quite large to a number of us, in things like the unspent amount or the unrestricted reserves rather than specific cuts, although there has been some discussion of specific cuts.
And I would say some good discussion on reducing expenses. I would like to propose that we target a tax rate of 57%. Or 57 cents, not percent. 57 cents.
So you're saying a reduction of 3.5 cents?
Right.
I can support that.
I have a question that I think would determine my willingness to go there. I'm not sure I yet have a sense. We have Ms. Brooks' memo about fund balance, and my recollection of the bottom line on that was stick with what you got. I'm wondering how much we could, how much trying to reduce the tax rate while not specifying certain things that would be eliminated to get there would therefore mean that what's left is you reduce the fund balance. And what that would do to it, say, at 3.5 cents. Was that?
I have to confess, Mayor, maybe it's the lateness of the evening, but I'm not sure I understand the question. I apologize.
If I were to say yes, that's a good target of reducing 3.5 cents. That's like,
what would that
so
do?
that means about round figures $700,000
correct
change. And therefore, if there were, could that be made up from some specific areas where expenditures were reduced in combination with a different number for what a fund balance would be?
I think we truthfully would just have to take a look at the expenditures and run some numbers and bring those back to you. I don't want to sit here and just speculate off the top of my head.
Well,
Yvonne may have an idea.
I'm just trying to come up with how to what is any consideration of any number going to be a combination of specific reductions in expenditures or increases in assumptions on revenues only, or is it going to be part of it is change the assumption on the fund balance?
Well, if you look at, for example, the chart that Josh put together with a 3-year total of $5.2 million in unspent budget, and if you take out the, if you multiply 900,000, which was given as the amount roughly for a recent year, and you make the, and you multiply by 3, you get 2.7 million. So that's roughly half of the 5.2. So if we take the 5.2 down to 2.5, let's say, roughly, then you have 2.5 million in a rather large cushion. And it seems to me, if you were trying to be conservative about it, and you said, well, how about half of that? You know, there's $1 million. That's a rather large additional cushion. You know, it has nothing to do with cutting any program. It's merely recognizing the fact that we don't spend all that we budget, that things happen, and our unspent money turns out to be quite a bit every year. And I think that there are a couple of other places. I mentioned the one about, I think we have too big a reserve. But just that alone, there's $1 million right there.
And that was kind of my question of, you know, how specific do those other pieces have to be, or is there this fungible number that we seem to be dancing around saying that is what can absorb the change?
Well, essentially what I'm asking is, could the city manager and Yvonne do a little more work around this idea of the unspent budget and give us, you know, some better numbers for it, so we have a better idea of what that might be. I mean, these are, the thing that Josh put together is very ballpark, and the city manager identified one rather large problem with the numbers, and, you know, it'd be nice to have a more careful analysis done of just that.
Councilmember Robinson.
And the other side of that is that classic thing of, well, spend all your budget or you won't get it next year. That takes place, at least it's legendary. I don't know how true it is in at the federal level. If you don't spend everything in your budget, you won't get that same amount next year. So we don't want to instill that as a kind of a way of doing business in our own government. I actually think it's great that we underspend in that regard, and that we respect the staff to make efficiencies as we go along. But I wanted to go to the point that City Manager Matthews made about the priority of New Hampshire Avenue, and that was a priority that priority has been in place for some years. That was before my time on the council. There were 3 priorities, as I recall. That was one. Affordable housing was one, and I don't remember the third. Do you remember that, Mayor Williams? They were the 3 stated priorities that the council had.
It was either...
It was a community center at one time.
Yeah,
Oh, I think that's it. The community center.
And at one time it was public safety, and at another time it was the kind of rebates.
Right.
It was,
New Hampshire Avenue came in right after
it was
I came into
I
office.
think it was New Hampshire Avenue tax duplication in the community.
Tax duplication. There we go. These are important priorities that that are historical in a sense, that we carry along with us, and we spent a lot of time on the strategic plan and came up with many priorities, and then tried to prioritize all those priorities and got sort of lost in those weeds, in my opinion. And so I take note of your at least bringing this to the table, City Manager Matthews, and I think it's important for us to think about that. And as far as New Hampshire Avenue goes, it's very much a work in progress. It hasn't gotten very far from a point of view of economic development. I know that staff has spent a good bit of time understanding the players and the dynamics of the situation on the ground, and who owns what and how it could evolve, and the sector plans and the interactions between the jurisdictions and all that stuff. And that's valuable knowledge for us to hang on to. But it is a different world now than the world that existed just before and during the charrette, when there was an expectation that, having done the charrette, everything would fall into place along New Hampshire Avenue. Well, I doubt if it's all going to fall into place this year along New Hampshire Avenue.
Projects like that literally take decades to realize.
Yeah. So my ears perked up when I heard you say that, and maybe it is an appropriate thing to back off a little bit on the amount of energy we spend on that particular priority.
Yeah, and I'm not suggesting necessarily that the council back off on any of its priorities. I guess what I'm saying is, as your city manager, certainly my goal is to try to meet every expectation you have in every single area. And I will try to juggle and make that happen the very best way that I can, but you know,
but if we can give you direction that you don't have to cover them all,
I'm not a miracle worker, but I will certainly do that. I guess I'm just saying, if I find that I can't keep all the balls in the air, is there one that you're willing to drop, I guess.
Yeah.
Councilmember Siemens.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I feel very bad that we're putting this burden on the city manager at this late hour. And
that's what I'm here for.
Well, at this late date is what I mean, not just the hour of the night, but the fact there's very little time between now and when we're asking for the answers back. I think the bottom line for me is, though, I would want to see, I think some of these other ideas with the reserves and some of the other things are important, and I think it's valuable to look at those, but I do really want to look at how we can reduce expenditures in those areas that do affect the tax rate. And I think it's really valuable for the city manager to be looking at these things and giving us kind of a menu to pick from within reason, using her judgment on what's reasonable to do. I think we're not at this point looking for things like eliminating the police department or sending the dispatchers to Rockville. I think what we're looking for is where we can reduce expenditures in a way that we all know would be maybe difficult for the community, but acceptable to the community. And I just think there are some things that are probably we could all agree are of a lower priority, that even if we still want to do them, that we could do them in a future year.
Mayor, may I ask a follow-up question to Councilmember Seaman's statement, if that's okay? Is there a majority of the council that would agree what Councilmember Seaman just stated, that you are not interested in doing a wholesale restructuring of the services the city provides? And what I would say by that is closing the library, having the county perform police services, not playing a role in planning activities, in other words, relying on park and planning to do project review. I'm just trying to think of the things off the top of my head that I'm just trying to get a sense of the scale of what type of change would or would not be acceptable to the council.
I think it would be unrealistic for this council to ask you to do that type of analysis in one day. We would at least give you a weekend for that.
Thank you. Councilmember Siemens, I appreciate your consideration.
Yeah, I'm on board with a steady as she goes kind of.
And I'm talking about within the realm. I'm not saying there would be no changes, but
right.
There's a difference between, I think, some of the things that have been mentioned by some of you this evening and the ones just cited by Councilmember Siemens. Those are obviously fairly, there's status quo, there's tweaks in the middle or the lower range, and then there's the ones Councilmember Siemens mentioned, which is a fundamental restructuring of what services this city provides. So I guess I'm just trying to get
No, I think that's great. We get some direction from the council on what we expect.
I think that's a fair assessment, given where we are in the process and how we started the process and the time we gave ourselves to do the process. If we really wanted to look at changing one of those things, we should probably start like in September for the following budget year.
I agree. Right. Can I ask just one or two follow-up questions? I'm just trying to get a sense of guidance, so I'm giving you what you need. My preference as a manager, and I think certainly what I conveyed to ask me, and it's my own personal philosophy, is I believe my obligation and the obligation of this city is to try to protect to the extent possible the interest of those employees who are currently employed. So if I were to try to keep personnel costs down, I would look at vacant positions first for possible elimination, and I would not be adding new staff. That would be my preference as a manager, that if there were interest in kind of downsizing our workforce or downsizing our personnel cost, within reason of the services that we're trying to provide in the council's objectives, is that I would look to vacancies first. And I can say, and this is not a discussion I think we probably need to get into this evening, I think it's very challenging to, even within a department, and I'm going to cite Public Works because I would probably envision any kind of environmental coordinator position, probably reporting to Daryl, quite frankly. I can tell you, even talking to Daryl, while I think she appreciates the offer of help in that realm, she herself would probably prefer to be able to staff some of her vacancies from an operational standpoint than she would be given a position that's new. I'm not asking the council to have that discussion this evening, but I guess I'm just trying to get a sense if the council would, at least in general theory, agree with my concept that we do not want to be laying off employees, which I believe is a comment Mayor Williams made at the very beginning.
I have no interest in exploring that option at all.
Okay.
I don't think it's necessary.
I don't sense that anybody is willing to go there.
I would agree.
The only thing I would say on that is if there are functions that somebody is performing that need to shift, that person shift along with those functions. Or if somebody's doing work that we decide is not appropriate or necessary or that can be trimmed, the job can be trimmed or the function can be trimmed, then that person needs to be doing something different.
It's a realignment of kind of the duty staff performs, and that is the practice that I think I have tried to put in place, at least since I've been with the city.
And if I can just add as an example of the kind of thing, as I look through the suggestions that you came up with of possible areas, the one that struck me was that there was a vacancy of a library assistant, and that the practical effect was if that position wasn't filled, it might reduce the library hours by a couple hours a week. I thought, well, that might be a reasonable way to go.
I guess the last question, at least I'm going to shut up. I think some of the staff's looking at me like I want to go home. One of the things I guess I've seen in other cities, and once again, it may be a discussion the council just wants to think about and give me some direction on Monday evening or talk about amongst yourselves. But when you start looking to kind of realign your budget, many of the cities that I have worked in have had sort of a soul-searching philosophical review of what are the services that should be borne by the entire populace through property taxes, and where is it appropriate to move to user fees. So those who are actually receiving the service pay full freight for that. And as part of this budget process, you know, we've given some examples of that. There's not tons of money in it, but there is some. I would encourage you all to look at that, because I think there are two ways of looking at it. One is, you know, there's the expenditure side of the equation, which is very valid to look at. There's the other is, are there people receiving services that should be paying more for that rather than the entire community? I don't, off the top of my head, that late this evening, I don't know that I have any specific examples. Quite often you do see that. It's usually not full cost recovery. I've seen it in many cities I've worked in who have taken a much different approach to recreation services than this council has. That's perfectly fine. It can vary from city to city. Some cities I've worked in, and I'm not proposing this, truthfully did not provide leaf vacuuming services as part of its general tax-supported functions. It was done with city staff, but they actually charged for it because there was a private market option for people. Once again, I'm not suggesting that. I'm just trying to point out that that's the way some cities I have worked in have tended to look at things as they started trying to realign their budgets.
Councilmember Robinson.
I think those are also very good points, City Manager Matthews. We're thinking of spending $1 million and change on this room. It's going to become a, some people might say, state-of-the-art, or at least certainly an enhanced
State of the city.
State of the city, an enhanced venue, and it would be grand if it was really used. And at the same time, if it's that good, and I think this will be the best venue within some miles of here, then it ought to be a resource that can be not maximized, but certainly, you know, worked. And that's the kind of entrepreneurial thinking that I think that we can do a better job at. And as similarly with the leaves, I'm with you on that one too.
I'm not proposing that.
Right. Well, at the same time, it's better to compost your leaves in your own backyard. It's oftentimes, not every time, but oftentimes it's good for the lawn. It's good for the beds of, you know, compost it in a corner or something like that. So that's always an option.
And just a quick comment on utilization of this room after it gets redone. I think it's going to require some discussion by the council about what our use policy is and what our charging policy is, because essentially, up to this point in time, we've given the direction we don't want to charge anybody for anything, essentially. And we have to relook at that.
Yeah, I think that's a difficult one to do again overnight, though.
We don't have to do it.
Please don't go.
We don't have, we don't have to
do it.
We don't have to do it anytime in the next few
I'm
weeks.
begging you.
So, I guess the question that remains for me is, do we have some consensus about a target in terms of the cents reduction in the rate to give the city manager the parameter for what she's looking for to come back to with us? And I'll just say that I ask that because I'm not sure I'm ready to go 3.5-cent reduction. I'm certainly there looking at reduction. I'm certainly comfortable in saying that I'd be looking at 2 cents. But is there a range that we want to kind of say this is where we're looking? I heard some people chime in that, yeah, 3.5 cents was good, but I just want to make sure. I want to go back around because that's going to drive what you're coming back to us with, correct?
Right. Several of you have commented on, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, you can tell me if I'm correct in what I believe I'm hearing, is of all the options that kind of got thrown out last Monday night where it kind of went from half 1, 2, and it just became kind of everything in the kitchen sink, is that the council has a clear interest in trying to reduce the tax rate and the associated burden on city residents in terms of what they are paying. You're not interested in a wholesale restructuring of city services, which obviously gets you the most bang for your buck, so to speak. But my sense is that the council is looking somewhere beyond the half-cent to 1 cent. So as I go about doing my work with staff, would it be fair to say that the council is interested in something in the range of 2 to 3 cents? Is that a
2 to 3.5 cents? Because you've already put the 3.5
at the
out
risk
there.
of saying 2 to 3 is close enough to government work for my purposes? I mean, is that kind of what I'm hearing from a majority of the council?
Yeah, I think 2 cents is a minimum. We have to get 2 cents.
And I think kind of what I am hopeful that we get back is a menu that maybe lets us hit that, the target, whatever the target is, which means there's probably some things on there that carry us over that target. So that, in other words,
Over which direction?
well, in other words, if the city manager comes back with a list and says, okay, if you do this, it saves you 2 cents, and there's a couple things on there that you didn't want.
You want some
Then-
flexibility.
Yeah, exactly. We would want some flexibility in the list so that there's some things say, oh, wow, we couldn't do that,
Yeah.
or did you consider this? And maybe
Yeah, don't
add
give us something that if you take everything, it gets to 3 cents.
My typical, I went through this exercise and was for different reasons, and what this council is doing it for, is I worked in one city where I was trying to identify, it was like $300,000 to $400,000. What I gave that council was a combination of revenue enhancement options and expenditures that was in the range of $1 million, because there were clearly some as soon as they looked. I'm not saying I can
Right.
quite do that in the time we have now, but it was to try to give the council at least some flexibility, and that would certainly be my goal, was to give you some options that you could look at. My sense is that there may be different feelings in terms of what is an appropriate level of unrestricted fund balance. I feel confident in saying that this council is, just given my history with this council, that you're not interested in driving the fund balance to a point that it puts the city either in cash flow difficulties or drives you into the ground financially, where you would have
But that
difficulty getting bond rating.
But it may be a little piece of what gets us to where we want to go.
Yeah, there is a point, I think, as Ms. Brooks indicated in her memo, where as your finance director, I think you would be, if the city were to go out and actually try to rate its bonds, we would be in trouble. And I don't think this council is interested in that level of reduction.
I'm just wondering whether in talking about, say, from 2 to 3.5 cents, we're talking about roughly 400,000 to 700,000, and maybe of that, maybe there's 200,000 difference in the fund balance that helps us get there, or something like that.
One thing I would remind the council, and then I think we can probably wrap up, is since this process has started with the reduction in highway user revenues, and depending on what is the outcome on the employee health insurance, and let's just assume we run into issues with the union, we can't negotiate with Aetna, or we can't find another carrier who is wanting to pick up our business at a lower rate, those two things alone essentially reduce the fund balance combined by about $160,000 just from the time I handed you this budget. Certainly, we're working to address that. Highway user revenues, I can't do anything for you, that's the state, but.
Yes, and I do hope you'll include in there, City Manager, a little refinement on the unspent.
I committed to doing that, Councilmember Snipper. I may, since I've run some of the reports and looked at them, I'm not sure if I can pull it together tomorrow by close of business. I will certainly make every effort to see if I can analyze that and get that to you.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, there's a couple items that are unusual items that if we were going to do, if we were going to spend something out of the fund balance, we could do those. And it's a tiny amount, but I mean, the Folk Festival essentially said that they're looking at a 1 to 2 year shortage, so they're not looking at being an ongoing burden on the city. There's a couple other things. The $15,000 request for the emergency services fund. I didn't ask for that as a year after year to become part of the operational budget, but just to help people in this downtime year, I would think that would be something you could use some reserve funds for, because that seems like what they're for. And then, I don't intend on supporting the pool on city dollars forever, but certainly they only got 6 months in the beginning to try to make things go, and I think they started with a $200+ grant, and they're down to $83,000 now, and they have some other models for making money, and so, I would consider that maybe a 1 to 2 year thing where we would kick in some money on that too. That seems like that would be inappropriate.
Councilmember Ray.
I was just going to say, I know we're asking the city manager for a tall order in terms of sharpening pencils and looking at things again. I feel very strongly that we need to continue to do something environmentally related, so I would want to see, at the very least, the 100% wind power in there and put forward on a straw vote. I know that's, I think, $30,000 that we have to come up with. I also feel like the coordinator position, I understand people's resistance, but if the person were hired and told to focus appropriately, I think it actually pay for itself. In looking for environmental improvements that are actually cost-saving as well. So, even though they're too tough, I think those things should be put to a straw vote before we do them. We don't want to say that we do it tonight, but it should be okay.
No, it's 11 o'clock.
Mayor, may I ask one last question? I promise you this will be the last one. I know you haven't had a chance to look through the information I gave you about the vacant positions, but one of the things you will note in many instances is certainly there is an opportunity to save money by the utilization of contractual labor or part-time assistants. Does the council have any indication this evening of whether you're open to that idea or if you are opposed to it?
I'm opposed to it.
Others?
I'm open to using part-time people where it's a strategy about employing people from the community and bringing them, job training and things like that.
I think with the positions we're talking about, I don't believe that would be the case. So it would simply be a matter of using a different type of workforce or contractual labor to reduce. It meets no other goals other than reducing
Right.
expenditures.
Well, the one that I can think of that's in there is in Public Works around I think one's leaf pickup and trash, and
One was an equipment operator, which is obviously very specialized work.
I don't know how I feel about equipment operator, but definitely the things that we do day after day, no, because then I'll have trash cans, all over my neighborhood, because it'll be whoever shows up that day, and
Correct.
the part-time, disconnected people throw trash cans around, and then people call me, and I'll be mad.
I appreciate that feedback.
That's not my issue, but back when we were discussing that resolution, passing that resolution, my desire was that we did not use contractual labor or part-time labor as a way of avoiding paying benefits, and I still feel that way.
So you would be a no unless there's an operational reason to do it?
Right.
Okay. Is that what I think Councilmember Snipper, Siemens, and Wright have indicated that in concept you're not supportive of doing that for cost-saving reasons? Is that correct? We have 3.
I'm in support of jobbing out when you get a better quality product or it makes sense. For the example of the website work where it might cost a little more, but you might have an expert doing it, that makes a lot of sense to me, where you put it out there for somebody to do a better job. And while I'm on it, I just have to say that the budget reduction scenario sheet under administration lists the management assistant, and I wonder the extent to which that person's duties can be shifted to the environmental assessment and efficiencies task. I don't expect an answer right now.
You're saying whether that position could perform some of those
perform
tasks?
some of those tasks.
Darrell and I had some brief discussion about that. Certainly in the time between Monday night and now, there wasn't a lot of substantive discussion. She and I touched briefly on it. I can become prepared to discuss that next Monday evening.
Okay, thank you.
No.
And as far as the question about the part-time or contractual, I would say that I would be open to kind of potentially the low-hanging fruit on that there might be 1 or 2 of those that you discussed. I didn't get a chance to read them in depth, but there might be an opportunity in 1 or 2 places. So I wouldn't just say no to everything, but there's probably a lot of them that I wouldn't agree with, but some I might.
What I'm sort of hearing is the support for doing that is relatively soft unless there's another objective to be attained. And I'm not, that's my general sense that I'll run with. Okay.
We're adjourned.
Thanks. Good night, everybody.
Right.